A peasant's life in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, the majority of people in Europe lived as peasants. These peasants, often bound to the land through the system of feudalism, had lives that were shaped by hard work, simple pleasures, and constant struggles against the elements. Unlike the noble classes who enjoyed the luxury of insulated homes and regular feasts, peasants lived in conditions that were harsh by modern standards. Yet despite their many challenges, medieval peasants managed to survive and even build enduring communities in the face of poverty, illness, and a variety of environmental hardships. One of the most difficult aspects of life for medieval peasants was the cold. Winter in medieval Europe could be harsh, particularly in northern regions where snow and ice were frequent. The climate of the time, known as the Little Ice Age, made winters colder and longer than the temperate conditions we might expect today. These winters were more than a seasonal inconvenience, they were life-threatening. Without modern heating or the luxury of warm clothing made from synthetic fibers, peasants had to rely on traditional methods of survival to endure the freezing temperatures. The peasant home, a place of hardship and resilience. The peasant's home was, by today's standards, a very simple structure. Most peasants lived in small, single-room cottages made of timber, wattle and daub, or stone. The roofs were typically thatched with straw, and there were no chimneys, just a fire in the middle of the room. These homes often had only one or two windows, covered with animal skins, or wooden shutters to keep out the cold. The lack of insulation in these homes meant that heat from the fire did not stay inside for long, and the cold seeped in through cracks in the walls and gaps in the roof. In these homes, peasants would gather around the hearth for warmth. The hearth, which served as the main source of heat and the cooking area, was usually located in the center of the room. The fire would burn day and night, but the warmth it provided was often insufficient to fend off the chill, especially during the coldest months. The smoke from the fire would also fill the room, as there were no chimneys to draw the smoke outside, creating an uncomfortable and unhealthy environment. The smoke, combined with the lack of proper ventilation, often led to respiratory problems, especially during the winter months. Peasant families were large, and many slept in the same room, sometimes sharing beds or sleeping on straw mats on the floor. The close quarters were a necessity, as heat from the fire would provide some warmth for everyone, but it also meant that space was limited. Children, animals, and sometimes even livestock would share the warmth of the hearth, as it was common for peasants to keep their animals in the house during the coldest months to protect them from the elements. This close proximity to animals, though practical, contributed to unsanitary living conditions, as waste would accumulate inside the home. The cold temperatures and lack of proper insulation made the winter months incredibly difficult for medieval peasants. In fact, surviving the cold was one of the most pressing concerns of the time. The winter months could bring severe frost and snow, and if food supplies ran low, peasants were forced to rely on what they could grow or store from the harvest. But even the best of harvests could be ruined by early frosts, which would limit food stores and leave families vulnerable. The diet of medieval peasants typically consisted of grains like wheat, barley and rye, along with vegetables such as peas, beans, cabbage and onion. Meat was a rare luxury, often only available on feast days or during the slaughtering season. The threat of starvation combined with the cold made survival a constant struggle. In addition to food shortages, winter also brought the risk of disease. The close quarters in peasant homes and the unsanitary conditions created by the lack of proper waste disposal made it easier for illnesses to spread. Winter was the time when illnesses like the flu, colds and pneumonia could take hold, especially among the elderly and children, who were more vulnerable. The inability to maintain personal hygiene due to cold water and limited resources only exacerbated the spread of disease. Without modern medical treatments or the knowledge of germ theory, the medieval peasant had little recourse against the diseases that ravaged their communities. Yet, despite these hardships, peasants developed coping mechanisms that helped them survive the cold winter. They relied on the community, on shared resources, and on traditional knowledge passed down through generations to keep them warm, fed and healthy during the winter months. Traditional methods of coping with the cold. One of the primary ways peasants managed the cold was through the use of layers of clothing made from wool, linen, and animal skins. Wool was an especially important material, as it is an excellent insulator and retains warmth even when wet. Peasants would wear several layers of woolen clothing, such as tunics, cloaks and parts to keep out the cold. Woolen socks and boots, along with gloves, were also common. These garments were often handmade by the peasants themselves or traded with neighboring villages. Clothing was designed for practicality rather than style, and warmth was always the priority. In addition to clothing, peasants used a variety of techniques to keep their homes warm. One of the most common methods was the use of draft-proofing technique. This involved sealing cracks in the walls with clay or mud, or stuffing gaps with straw or rags. The goal was to minimize the cold air that could seep in through the walls or window. Some peasants even went so far as to cover their windows with animal skins or oiled cloth, as glass was a luxury that few could afford. Fires were kept burning continuously, and the hearth became the heart of the home, with families gathering around it for warmth. Food also played an important role in surviving the cold. During the winter months, peasants relied heavily on preserved foods, such as salted meats, dried vegetables, and grains. They would also store root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and parsnips, which could be kept for several months. The preservation of food through salting, pickling, and smoking was an essential part of the peasant survival strategy. These methods helped ensure that there was enough food to last through the long, harsh winter when fresh produce was scarce. But despite their best efforts, the winter months remained an uncertain time. How long could a family survive on stored food before it ran out? What if the weather was harsher than usual, or if an illness took hold of the family? What if the harvest had failed and there was little to eat? These were constant worries for the peasant families, who lived in a constant state of vulnerability. As we reflect on the life of medieval peasants, we are left with a fundamental question: how did these families endure the harsh winters and the many other challenges they faced? What inner resilience or survival strategies allowed them to cope with the difficult realities of their time? The daily struggles and survival tactics of medieval peasants. The survival strategies of medieval peasants during the harsh winters were not just about keeping warm. They were part of a broader survival plan that extended to food security, health, and social structures. Life for the average peasant was not only a matter of enduring physical hardship, but also managing a web of challenges that ranged from the weather to the ever-present pressure of feudal obligations. Despite the bleak conditions, peasants found ways to cope with the frigid winters, though their coping mechanisms were often based on resourcefulness and the shared efforts of the community. These tactics, rooted in necessity, were key to maintaining not just individual survival, but the very structure of rural medieval society. The importance of food security for the peasant. The cold winter months often meant more than just staying warm. It was a time of potential hunger. Food security was a constant concern for peasants, who were heavily reliant on their own crops for sustenance. Many of the most essential crops for survival, grains such as wheat, rye, oats, and barley, were harvested in the fall. However, the harvest itself could be uncertain, and a poor harvest could spell disaster. Even a minor failure could lead to hunger, especially as the winter months dragged on and fresh food became increasingly scarce. The preservation of food was paramount, and the methods employed were as diverse as they were necessary. One of the most common preservation methods was salting. Salt was used to preserve meats, which were hung from rafters or stored in barrels. Fish, especially in coastal areas, dried or salted and could last throughout the winter. In many households, pigs were slaughtered in the fall, with the meat carefully salted and cured to provide food for months. Along with salted meats, peasants also relied on pickled vegetables, fermented cabbage, and other preserved foods to get through the lean months. Root vegetables were another critical part of the peasant diet. Carrots, parsnips, turnips, and other hardy vegetables could be stored in root cellars or buried in the ground to keep fresh throughout the winter. These vegetables, along with dried beans and legumes, made up a significant portion of the winter diet. The storage of grains, too, was crucial. Wheat, rye, and oats were often stored in large sacks, and careful attention had to be paid to prevent rodents or pests from contaminating the supply. Despite these efforts, the winter months were still a precarious time. The food that had been carefully preserved could spoil, and any failure to manage food stores properly could lead to malnutrition or even starvation. The survival of the entire community depended on the careful management of food supplies, and families often relied on trade and bartering with neighbors to make up for any shortages. The role of the community in survival. The feudal system that defined medieval society also played a role in how peasants survived the cold months. In exchange for the right to work land and grow food, peasants were obligated to provide services to their lord. These services, known as feudal duties, could include working on the lord's land, maintaining roads and buildings, or even providing goods or soldiers in times of war. These obligations were not just burdensome, they were crucial to the survival of the entire community. While peasants worked the land to feed themselves, they also worked together in communal tasks, such as harvesting, repairing homes, and tending to animals. This cooperation ensured that no one family bore the full burden of survival alone. If one family had a poor harvest or suffered from illness, neighbors would step in to help. The concept of community, while primarily born out of necessity, was an important part of medieval rural life. Shared work on the land, in the home, and in the community ensured that peasants could endure even the coldest winters. In times of extreme hardship, peasants might come together to pool their resources, whether through shared food or the labor required to keep homes and farms in good condition. The communal nature of peasant life, built on mutual support, helped mitigate the risk of total failure, making the difference between survival and starvation during the harshest times. Even within a feudal structure, peasants were not entirely isolated from one another. Their survival strategies often relied on the collective effort of the local community. The dangers of disease and health concerns. While food scarcity and the cold were immediate threats, the danger of illness was another persistent issue for medieval peasants. The long winter months, with their close quarters and damp, smoky homes, were a breeding ground for disease. The most common illnesses were respiratory infections, such as pneumonia and tuberculosis, as well as various fevers and plagues. The cold weather itself weakened the immune system, making peasants more susceptible to illness, while poor nutrition, often linked to food scarcity, also contributed to the spread of disease. In addition to illness, the lack of sanitation in peasant homes created further health risks. Without plumbing or modern sewage systems, waste was typically disposed of in nearby fields or in the rivers that ran through villages. This unsanitary environment provided ideal conditions for the spread of disease, particularly gastrointestinal illnesses, which were common in the Middle Ages. Contaminated water sources, along with the poor living conditions, made illness more frequent and more difficult to control. However, peasants developed their own methods of dealing with illness. Herbal remedies, passed down through generations, were used to treat a range of ailments. Many herbs, such as sage, thyme, and garlic, were believed to have medicinal properties and were used in cooking or brewed into teas. In addition, peasants would often rely on local healers or wise women who had knowledge of these remedies. While these methods were rudimentary by modern standards, they were the best available means of combating illness and promoting health in a world with no doctors, hospitals, or vaccines. The mental and emotional strain of survival. While the physical challenges of surviving winter in the Middle Ages were immense, the psychological strain on peasants cannot be overlooked. The constant pressure to provide for one's family, protect against illness, and endure the cold created a level of anxiety and stress that affected all aspects of life. The unpredictability of weather, crop yields, and the availability of resources meant that peasants lived in a state of uncertainty, often unable to predict if they would have enough to eat or whether their homes would survive the next winter storm. The seasonal nature of agricultural work also played a role in the psychological impact on peasants. During the winter, there were fewer tasks to be done in the fields, which led to long periods of inactivity and isolation. While the summer months were filled with constant work, the winter months were quieter, and peasants often found themselves in the company of only their families or a few close neighbors. The lack of social interaction and the monotony of winter could lead to depression, anxiety, and even despair, as peasants struggled to keep their households functioning in the face of persistent hardship. Yet, for all the difficulties, peasants found ways to endure. The bonds between families and communities, as well as a deep connection to the land and seasonal rhythms, provided a sense of stability. Holidays, religious observances, and communal celebrations, though few and far between, also provided respite from the harsh realities of everyday life. Feasts, though modest, were a welcome break, especially after the winter harvest. These moments of connection and celebration helped peasants maintain hope and fostered a sense of shared identity and resilience. Survival in medieval Europe, particularly through the coldest of winters, was not just a matter of physical endurance but also of community support, cultural resilience, and mental fortitude. The way peasants adapted to their circumstances, relying on what little resources they had, and drawing on a deep well of traditional knowledge, is a testament to their remarkable capacity for survival. As we look back on the lives of medieval peasants, we are left with a thought-provoking question. How did the collective resilience of these communities, built on shared hardship, communal work, and mutual dependence, help them survive in an unforgiving world? Could their strategies, which relied on close-knit networks of support, offer lessons for us in modern times, when isolation and individualism are often more pronounced? The legacy of medieval peasants and lessons for today. The story of medieval peasants is one that remains largely unknown to the modern world. Their lives, shaped by hard labor, struggle, and a deep reliance on their communities, present an image of resilience and survival against the odds, while the details of their day-to-day existence, working the land, tending to animals, enduring the elements, may seem uneventful or dull in the context of modern history. They were, in fact, the foundation upon which much of medieval society rested. In the context of harsh winters, poor living conditions, and limited resources, peasants displayed extraordinary resourcefulness, cooperation, and determination. The enduring impact of peasant survival strategies. While the medieval peasant's life was defined by hardship, it was also marked by an enduring sense of survival, even as their environment grew more difficult. Colder winters, limited access to food, and the constant threat of disease, peasants found ways to adapt. The strategies they used to survive, many of which were based on necessity, would become deeply embedded in their cultural and social fabric. The communal nature of peasant life was one of the cornerstones of their survival. In a world where individual survival was difficult, cooperation was essential. A single peasant family might have struggled to survive, but through mutual support, whether in times of harvest, sickness, or construction, peasants created a safety net that protected them from the worst of the dangers. This system, while rooted in necessity, created social bonds that transcended mere survival. Communities were built on the strength of these relationships, where neighbors helped one another with everything from harvesting crops to tending to the sick. Without this cooperation, the harshness of medieval life would have been even more unbearable. It's important to recognize that the strategies medieval peasants used weren't just about physical survival, they also represented their resilience in the face of adversity. The fact that these peasants persisted year after year through such harsh conditions speaks to a determination that kept their communities intact. These strategies, whether for warming homes, preserving food, or protecting against disease, were not merely reactive, they were proactive measures designed to ensure the survival of their way of life. In addition to the personal resilience of peasants, their survival was heavily shaped by the broader feudal and agricultural systems they inhabited. While the structure of feudalism may seem archaic and unjust by modern standards, it provided a form of social safety net. The lord's land provided a sense of security, albeit one that was exploitative, for peasants, as it ensured that they had access to the land they worked and a basic level of protection in exchange for services. This system, while oppressive, created a kind of stability that allowed peasants to weather some of the storms, both literal and metaphorical, that came their way. The role of religion and spirituality in peasant survival. Religion played a significant role in shaping the lives of medieval peasants, particularly in how they coped with the harsh realities of their existence. The Christian faith was an omnipresent part of daily life, offering a sense of comfort, hope, and purpose. The Catholic Church was deeply intertwined with medieval society, providing both spiritual guidance and practical assistance. Church services and religious holidays offered peasants an opportunity for spiritual renewal and respite from the grind of daily life. The Church also provided a moral framework for dealing with hardship. In times of sickness, famine, or death, peasants turned to their faith for solace. Religious practices such as prayer, fasting, and pilgrimage helped them cope with the challenges they faced, offering hope that their struggles would be rewarded in the afterlife. The idea of suffering as a test or as a part of God's divine plan allowed peasants to endure their difficult lives with the belief that they would eventually be rewarded for their patience and resilience. The Church also played a role in providing support during times of crisis. In many regions, the Church provided charity to the poor, including peasants. The Church often organized food distribution, offered shelter, or provided other forms of assistance to those in need. These acts of charity were both a reflection of religious values and a practical response to the widespread poverty that many peasants faced. While religion was an essential part of life, it also served to reinforce the social hierarchy of medieval society. The church was a powerful institution that supported the feudal system, which kept peasants in a subordinate position. The church's teachings often emphasized submission to authority and patience in the face of adversity. In this sense, religion not only helped peasants endure their hardships, but also provided a justification for their social and economic status. Modern relevance: what we can learn from medieval peasants. The history of medieval peasants, especially in how they survived harsh winters, poverty, and disease, is not just a story of the past. It holds valuable lessons for us today, particularly in how we deal with adversity, cooperation, and resilience. In a world where many people face economic challenges, climate change, and the breakdown of traditional social safety nets, the survival strategies of medieval peasants offer a reminder of the power of community, adaptability, and perseverance. Peasants in the Middle Ages didn't have the resources or technologies that we take for granted today, yet they managed to survive through their resourcefulness and cooperation. In many ways, their approach to survival was holistic, focused not just on physical needs, but on the emotional, social, and spiritual aspects of life. The importance of social bonds, shared resources, and collective action in the face of hardship is something that resonates deeply in modern times. As we face global challenges, whether related to climate change, economic inequality, or health crises, the ability to come together as communities and support one another in times of need will be crucial. The medieval peasants' ability to endure, even in the face of overwhelming difficulties, can inspire us to work together and adapt to challenges we face. Their emphasis on communal cooperation, shared labor, and mutual support is as relevant today as it was centuries ago. Additionally, the resilience demonstrated by peasants in the face of adversity also highlights the importance of mental and emotional fortitude. They were not just enduring hardship physically, but also psychologically, relying on their faith, their communities, and their own inner strength to keep going. In modern times, we can draw from that same well of resilience, using our connections with others and our determination to face challenges head-on. Ultimately, the legacy of medieval peasants is one of survival, community, and adaptation. Their strategies for surviving the cold, harsh winters were rooted in necessity, but their broader way of life teaches us valuable lessons in how to cope with adversity, lean on each other, and persevere, no matter how difficult the circumstances. As we look at the resilience of medieval peasants, we are reminded of the importance of community and cooperation in overcoming challenges. How might we, in our modern world, learn from their ability to survive despite the odds? What can we do to foster the sense of solidarity and mutual support that was so essential to their survival? The plague of Justinian, a pandemic that shaped the ancient world, the rise of the Byzantine Empire, and the emergence of the plague. In the 6th century, the Eastern Roman Empire, more commonly known as the Byzantine Empire, was at a crossroad. The empire, once the heart of the Roman world, was now a fragmented remnant, struggling to assert its authority over a vast region. Under the reign of Emperor Justinian I, the Byzantine Empire sought to reclaim its former glory and expand its border. Justinian's ambition was evident in his attempts to reconquer lost territories, most notably in the West, where he launched military campaigns to retake Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain from the barbarian tribes that had overrun the Western Roman Empire. The most significant of Justinian's achievements was the codification of Roman law, known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, which laid the foundation for many legal systems in Europe and beyond. Under his rule, the Byzantine Empire experienced a period of revival and consolidation, especially in the 530s. The empire, though strained by external pressures, was attempting to restore a sense of unity, culture, and strength across its territory. However, in the midst of Justinian's ambitious reforms and military campaigns, a far more insidious force would strike the empire, forever altering the course of history. In 554 CE, the Byzantine Empire was hit by a pandemic that would come to be known as the Plague of Justinian. The plague would sweep across the Mediterranean world, decimating the population and severely weakening the empire. It was a catastrophe that in many ways would be eclipsed only by the later Black Death in the 14th century, but it played an equally pivotal role in shaping the course of medieval history. The plague of Justinian is believed to have originated in the region of Central Asia, where it spread westward along established trade routes. By the time it reached the Byzantine Empire, it had already wreaked havoc on other civilizations in its path. The pandemic was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death. While the symptoms and impact of the disease were similar to later outbreaks of plague, the scale of destruction in the 6th century was perhaps even more significant, given the population density and lack of medical knowledge at the time. The impact of the plague on Constantinople. The city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, was the epicenter of the plague's devastation. Constantinople, known today as Istanbul, was a bustling metropolis and a vital hub of trade, culture, and politics. It was home to over 500,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. The city was a melting pot of cultures and a center for the spread of Christianity, but it was also a city of great vulnerability. Its population was densely packed, and the constant influx of traders from across the empire and beyond made it an ideal target for the spread of infectious diseases. The first signs of the plague in Constantinople were reported in the spring. The disease spread quickly, infecting large segments of the population. It is said that the initial symptoms of the plague included fever, chills, swollen lymph nodes, and painful buboes, the latter giving rise to one of the common names for the disease, the bubonic plague. The rapid spread of the disease was further exacerbated by the fact that the bacterium Yersinia pestis was carried by fleas that lived on rats, which thrived in the densely populated and unsanitary conditions of the city. Once the disease took root, it moved quickly through Constantinople's population, and within a few months, it had killed tens of thousands of people. The plague of Justinian was devastating not just because of the high death toll, but because it struck at a time when the Byzantine Empire was at its most vulnerable. Justinian was in the midst of his military campaigns, attempting to reclaim former Roman territories in the west, and his army was now weakened by the plague. At the same time, the city of Constantinople, which had long been the heart of the Byzantine Empire, was facing a serious social and economic crisis. The collapse of the workforce and the breakdown of social order during the plague led to widespread panic, and trade slowed to a crawl as merchants and travelers sought to avoid the infected cities. The empire was left grappling with both external threats and internal instability. The spread of the plague across the empire. While Constantinople was hit hardest by the initial wave of the plague, the disease quickly spread throughout the empire and beyond, following the major trade routes across the Mediterranean. The plague spread to regions such as Syria, Egypt, and Italy, reaching as far as the southern parts of Gaul and Spain. It even crossed into North Africa, affecting the important grain-producing regions of the empire. The spread of the plague along trade routes was particularly significant because it revealed the deep interconnectedness of the ancient world. Merchants, soldiers, and travelers unknowingly carried the plague to distant land. The bustling ports of North Africa, including Alexandria, and the southern Italian cities of Naples and Rome, became major centers of infection. As a result, the plague of Justinian caused widespread devastation throughout the Mediterranean world, halting commerce, disrupting military campaigns, and causing widespread fear. At its peak, the plague is estimated to have killed between 25% and 50% of the population in some affected areas. It's difficult to know the exact death toll, but modern estimates suggest that millions of people across the Mediterranean world perished. In some cities, entire neighborhoods were abandoned as their populations dwindled. For the Byzantine Empire, the plague came at a critical moment. Justinian had ambitions of reuniting the Western Roman Empire, and his military campaigns had initially seen some success. However, with large portions of the army falling victim to the disease, his conquests were delayed or undermined. The reconquest of North Africa and Italy was further hampered by the plague, and while Justinian's generals were able to make some headway in the west, the empire's resources were severely stretched. By the time the plague subsided in 542 CE, Justinian's dream of an expansive Roman Empire was already beginning to fade. The political and social consequences of the plague. Beyond its immediate effects on the military and economy, the plague of Justinian had significant political and social consequences for the Byzantine Empire. The death toll from the plague led to a dramatic reduction in the workforce, which in turn caused agricultural production to plummet, Without enough laborers to tend to the fields, food shortages became a widespread concern. This shortage of food, combined with the disruption of trade, led to inflation and economic instability, further weakening the empire. The social fabric of the Byzantine Empire also began to fray. The plague caused widespread panic, and many people fled to the countryside to escape the disease, while others sought refuge in monasteries or religious centers. The general sense of fear and uncertainty gave rise to superstition, and some even believed that the plague was a divine punishment for the empire's sins. Religious leaders tried to provide comfort, but the scale of the disaster made it difficult for them to offer any lasting solution. The Byzantine government, led by Justinian, struggled to respond to the crisis. Though Justinian implemented various measures to curb the plague, such as quarantine efforts and social distancing, the empire lacked the infrastructure and understanding to deal effectively with the disease. Many of the empire's resources were diverted to dealing with the plague's effects, further weakening its capacity to defend against external threats. As the plague continued to ravage the empire, Justinian's ambitions of restoring the former Roman territories slowly faded. Despite the eventual stabilization of the empire, the consequences of the plague would be felt for centuries. The plague of Justinian marked the beginning of a long period of decline for the Byzantine Empire, and its effects can still be seen in the fragmentation of power and the eventual fall of Constantinople. But for now, we are left with a crucial question: how did the empire, after experiencing such a devastating loss, managed to stabilize itself over the long term? Was it purely due to Justinian's political and military abilities, or did the social, economic and religious changes brought on by the plague lay the groundwork for the empire's eventual transformation? The long-term effects of the plague and the transformation of the Byzantine Empire. The plague of Justinian, which first struck in 54 CE, is often seen as the beginning of a long and tumultuous period for the Byzantine Empire. While the initial wave of the plague caused immediate devastation, the long-term consequences were even more profound. The empire, already stretched thin by external military pressures and internal strife, would never fully recover from the impact of this pandemic. The collapse of its economic stability, the fragmentation of its social structures, and the weakening of its military forces set in motion a series of changes that would reshape the Byzantine Empire and the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. Economic decline and the strain on imperial resources. One of the most immediate and lasting effects of the plague of Justinian was the profound disruption of the empire's economy. The Byzantine economy, heavily reliant on agriculture and trade, faced a massive blow due to the loss of life. As mentioned previously, a significant portion of the population, including laborers and farmers, fell victim to the disease, leaving fields untended and agricultural production severely diminished. The empire's grain supply, vital for feeding both the city of Constantinople and its far-reaching territories, was disrupted, leading to food shortages, price inflation, and economic hardship for the surviving population. The collapse of the labor force was particularly felt in rural areas, where peasants were the backbone of the Byzantine economy. Without enough workers to cultivate crops, harvest grain, or maintain the empire's infrastructure, the agricultural sector suffered immense. Landowners were left with vast estates that could no longer be worked, and the empire saw a drop in tax revenue from these regions. The government struggled to fill the gap in its income, which led to a series of economic reforms and adjustments, some of which were unsuccessful, and others that further destabilized the economy. In urban areas, the impact of the plague was similarly devastating. Constantinople, the capital of the empire, was the heart of the Byzantine economy, a bustling center of trade and commerce. As the disease took hold, many of the city's artisans, traders and craftsmen died or fled, leading to a halt in production. The reduction in available labor meant that the manufacturing of goods, from textiles to pottery, slowed dramatically. With trade routes disrupted and a reduced labor force, the empire struggled to maintain its economic infrastructure. As a result of the collapse in production and trade, the Byzantine Empire found itself unable to sustain its military campaigns, further contributing to its territorial losses. With much of the imperial revenue derived from taxes on agricultural produce and the spoils of war, the loss of income and resources severely hampered Justinian's efforts to continue his ambitious military campaigns in the west. Social and religious changes in the aftermath of the plague. The plague of Justinian did more than just devastate the population. It fundamentally altered the social and religious fabric of the empire. In the wake of the pandemic, entire communities were wiped out, and many cities, including Constantinople, saw a sharp decline in population. The immediate aftermath of the plague saw a social disintegration that reflected both the terror of the disease and the collapse of traditional societal norms. The widespread fear of the plague led many to turn to religion for answers. Christian beliefs surrounding divine punishment and salvation became a focal point for peasants, urban dwellers, and elites alike. For the Byzantine Empire, the plague became a defining moment in the relationship between church and state. As the disease ravaged the empire, many believed that the plague was a sign of God's wrath, a punishment for the sins of the people. Religious leaders in the Eastern Orthodox Church preached repentance, urging the populace to atone for their perceived sins. The church played a central role in providing comfort and relief during this difficult time. Monasteries, which had long been a place for prayer and isolation, became centers of care and refuge. Monks and nuns worked tirelessly to care for the sick and dying, offering the solace of prayer and administering rudimentary medical care. Many church leaders saw the plague as a divine test, and their sermons often called on the people to be resilient in the face of this calamity. At the same time, the plague of Justinian had a profound impact on the social structure of the empire. The death of so many people, including priests and members of the elite, created a vacuum in leadership. New social leaders, both secular and religious, had to emerge to fill the gaps left by the deceased. This shift also altered the role of women in Byzantine society. In some areas, women took on more prominent roles in managing estates, caring for the sick, and leading the communities that were left behind. In rural areas, women often played a crucial role in keeping their households intact, as the loss of male workers and leaders left many women to shoulder the responsibilities of both family and labor. Additionally, the crisis led to a sharp rise in charitable giving and religious devotion, as the living sought to appease God for their survival. Pilgrimages to sacred sites became more common, and the building of churches and shrines increased as acts of piety. For many, the plague became a moment of spiritual reckoning, forcing individuals and families to turn inward, reflecting on their sins and seeking protection from further suffering. The role of the church also increased in shaping the Byzantine Empire's social fabric. After the plague, religious festivals, processions, and public prayers became essential tools for communal cohesion. The church not only offered physical care but also emotional and spiritual support, offering a sense of continuity and stability in the face of uncertainty. The decline of Justinian's vision and the fragmentation of the empire. The long-term impact of the plague of Justinian on the Byzantine Empire's military ambitions was undeniable. Justinian had set out to reconquer the western territories of the former Roman Empire, including North Africa, Italy, and Spain. His campaigns, though initially successful, were severely hindered by the plague. The deaths of soldiers, generals, and other key personnel weakened the Byzantine military. The resources that were diverted to deal with the plague's effects drained the empire's ability to maintain its military momentum. In the west, the reconquests of Italy and North Africa were significantly delayed by the plague. In some cases, cities and territories that had been retaken by Byzantine forces fell back into the hands of barbarian tribes or rival powers as Byzantine armies were weakened by the plague. The loss of North Africa, once a critical grain-producing region for the empire, marked a serious blow to the Byzantine economy. Without the grain from these territories, Constantinople and the rest of the empire struggled to maintain food security. Additionally, the disruption caused by the plague weakened the Byzantine Empire's position in the Mediterranean. Though the empire eventually recovered some of its territorial integrity, the once strong presence in the west was irreparably damaged. Over the next several centuries, the Byzantine Empire would increasingly struggle to defend its borders against growing threats from the Seljuk Turks, the Crusaders, and eventually the Ottoman Empire. The plague of Justinian, while devastating, did not lead to the immediate collapse of the Byzantine Empire. However, the pandemic had a lasting effect on its ability to project power and maintain the imperial system that had existed since the Roman Empire. The empire, though it endured for several more centuries, was permanently altered by the events of the 6th century. The plague of Justinian is often seen as one of the key events that marked the beginning of the Byzantine Empire's slow decline, leading to its eventual fall. In reflection on the plague's lasting impact, the plague of Justinian stands as one of the first recorded pandemics to profoundly alter the course of history. The disease not only changed the course of the Byzantine Empire, but also had a lasting impact on the Mediterranean world. The social, economic, and political consequences of the plague were felt for centuries, shaping the development of both Eastern and Western Europe. The plague of Justinian forced people to adapt in ways that would have a lasting effect on the trajectory of medieval and early modern Europe. The sense of fragility in human existence, reinforced by the plague, would be felt in later pandemics, particularly the Black Death of the 14th century. As we reflect on this ancient pandemic, it raises an important question: how can societies respond to such devastating events, and what can we learn from the experiences of past civilizations in the face of global crises? The long shadow of the plague and its lasting legacy. The plague of Justinian, which ravaged the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century, is one of the most significant pandemics in human history. Though it may not be as well known as the Black Death of the 14th century, it had a similarly far-reaching impact, shaping the course of European and Mediterranean history for centuries. The long-term effects of the plague are felt not only in the immediate aftermath, but also in the way it influenced the political, economic, and cultural dynamics of the medieval world. As we reflect on the plague of Justinian, it becomes clear that its legacy is intertwined with the broader narrative of the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the medieval world. The disintegration of Byzantine power. While the Byzantine Empire under Emperor Justinian I was able to recover to some extent from the initial shock of the plague, the long-term consequences were undeniable. The empire, already facing external pressures from neighboring powers and internal difficulties due to administrative inefficiency, was further weakened by the death of so many citizens and soldiers. The plague of Justinian contributed directly to the weakening of the empire's military capacity and its ability to maintain control over the vast territories it had sought to reconquer. Justinian's ambitious military campaigns, which aimed to restore the Roman Empire's former glory, were severely hindered by the plague. The disease took a heavy toll on the Byzantine military, particularly in the west, where the reconquests of Italy and North Africa were delayed or abandoned. The empire's attempts to reconquer Italy, under the general Belisarius, were particularly impacted, as the general's army was decimated by the plague. Without sufficient manpower, the Byzantine forces found themselves struggling to hold on to their newly gained territory. The loss of military strength in these areas marked a significant setback in Justinian's grand vision of restoring Roman unity. Furthermore, the death toll from the plague created a power vacuum within the empire. The loss of experienced generals, officials, and workers left the Byzantine state in disarray, struggling to maintain its administrative cohesion. The empire's ability to manage its provinces, especially in the face of growing external threats, became increasingly compromised. The weakening of the Byzantine state, which had once been a formidable power, meant that it would have difficulty defending its borders in the years to come. This decline in imperial power ultimately laid the groundwork for the empire's vulnerability to future invasions, such as those by the Seljuk Turks, and later the Ottoman Turks. Economic and agricultural consequences. The plague of Justinian had an immediate and catastrophic effect on the Byzantine economy. The decimation of the population, combined with the breakdown of agricultural production, led to widespread economic collapse. In rural areas, the lack of labor meant that farms could not be maintained, resulting in a dramatic drop in food production. With fewer hands to till the land, agricultural yields suffered, and famine became a constant threat. This disruption in food production was particularly damaging, as the empire relied heavily on its agricultural base to feed its population. In addition to the agricultural crisis, trade suffered a severe blow. Constantinople, as the heart of Byzantine trade, was a key center for commerce between Europe and Asia. The plague, which spread along the major trade routes, disrupted both local and long-distance trade. Merchants, who were integral to the empire's economic success, were either killed by the plague or fled the region to avoid infection. This halt in trade meant that vital goods such as grain, spices, and luxury items could not be transported, exacerbating food shortages and economic decline. The Byzantine Empire's coinage also suffered during this time. With fewer people working and producing goods, the tax base shrank, and the empire was forced to rely more heavily on a reduced supply of coinage. This further weakened the empire's ability to fund its military, infrastructure, and bureaucracy, accelerating its economic decline. Cultural and religious shifts. As the Byzantine Empire grappled with the consequences of the plague, its cultural and religious landscape also began to shift. The impact of the plague on religious life was significant, as the church became more central in the lives of ordinary people. The failure of imperial leadership and the destruction of communities led many people to turn to the church for both spiritual and practical support. Monasteries became essential centers of care, providing shelter, food, and medical attention to the sick and the poor. Religious leaders, including monks and bishops, played a crucial role in maintaining social order during this period of upheaval. In many cases, the church became the primary source of stability for individuals and families, offering protection and solace in the face of widespread death and destruction. The church also became more powerful in its influence over society. As the state weakened, the church filled the vacuum, providing spiritual guidance and social cohesion. The church's involvement in everyday life was not limited to religious ceremonies, but extended to the governance of communities, with religious leaders becoming influential in local politics. In some cases, the church became the arbiter of disputes, a role that had traditionally been filled by secular authorities. The increased importance of the church during this period also set the stage for the church's continued dominance in medieval European society. A lasting legacy: the impact on Europe and the rise of Islam. The plague of Justinian was not just an event that shaped the Byzantine Empire, it also had profound effects on the broader Mediterranean European world. The pandemic, which spread across the Mediterranean, reached areas like Egypt, North Africa, and parts of Italy, causing widespread devastation. The high mortality rate left behind a weakened and vulnerable population, which made it easier for other civilizations to rise and take advantage of the power vacuum left by the Byzantine decline. One of the most significant long-term effects of the plague was the rise of Islam in the 7th century. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by the plague, was unable to prevent the rapid expansion of Islamic forces, which spread across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain. The Muslim conquests, which had been set in motion by the death of Prophet Muhammad in 63 CE, gained momentum as the Byzantine Empire struggled to recover from the plague's devastation. The loss of key territories such as Syria, Egypt, and North Africa to Muslim forces further diminished Byzantine power. The spread of Islam had a profound impact on the region, as it altered the political and religious landscape of the Mediterranean. For the Byzantine Empire, the loss of Egypt, a vital grain-producing region, further contributed to its economic decline. The spread of Islamic culture, science, and philosophy in the centuries following the rise of Islam also marked a shift in the intellectual and cultural development of the region. Reflections on the plague's influence on history. The plague of Justinian stands as a stark reminder of the fragility of human societies in the face of pandemics. Its impact on the Byzantine Empire was profound, shaping the course of European and Mediterranean history for centuries. The disease, which killed millions, contributed to the weakening of the Byzantine Empire, destabilizing its economy, military, and political structure. While the empire did not collapse immediately, the effects of the plague set in motion a series of events that would ultimately lead to its decline. The legacy of the plague of Justinian is still felt today. It serves as an early example of the devastating impact that pandemics can have on societies, economies, and civilizations. The lessons learned from this early pandemic have influenced how we understand disease, public health, and social resilience in the modern world. As we reflect on the plague of Justinian, we are left with an important question: how did this event, and the subsequent challenges faced by the Byzantine Empire, shape the modern world in ways we might not have anticipated? Could the rise of new powers, such as Islam, and the transformation of Europe in the Middle Ages have been shaped by earlier pandemics? And how can these lessons guide us as we face our own global health crises? The Great Fire of London, rebuilding a city from ashes. The fire that changed London forever. In the early morning hours of September 2, 1666, a small flame ignited in a bakery on Pudding Lane in London. What began as a spark in a modest, overcrowded area of the city quickly spiraled into one of the most devastating urban fires in history. The Great Fire of London, as it became known, would destroy much of the medieval city, leaving tens of thousands of people homeless. But it would also serve as a turning point in the city's development, changing its architecture, its infrastructure, and its very approach to urban planning. At the time, London was a bustling metropolis of over 400,000 people, but it was also a city of poor infrastructure, tightly packed buildings and cramped streets. The city's buildings were largely made of timber, a highly flammable material that made the entire city vulnerable to fire. The medieval street plan, with narrow, winding lanes, meant that when fires did break out, it was nearly impossible to control them. The night before the fire broke out, London had experienced a relatively mild autumn, and people were still active in the streets. The city had just experienced an outbreak of the plague, which had killed thousands, and was still recovering from the effects of that epidemic. The residents of London, already shaken by disease and loss, were ill prepared for the catastrophe that would unfold. The fire began in the house of Thomas Fariner, a baker on Pudding Lane. It is believed that a spark from his oven ignited a nearby pile of firewood, which quickly spread to the rest of his house. Because of the dry, windy weather and the timber construction of the surrounding buildings, the fire rapidly spread from house to house. The narrow streets and the crowded conditions made it impossible for residents to escape quickly, and the fire grew at an alarming rate. The wind blew embers across the city, starting new fires in other areas and creating a sense of panic. Within hours, large swaths of London were engulfed in flames. The fire spread to the nearby areas of the City of London, including the famous medieval landmarks such as St. Paul's Cathedral and the Royal Exchange. The destruction was swift and relentless, with flames leaping from building to building. By the time the fire had been brought under control, 3/4 of the city had been destroyed. The destruction and human cost. The Great Fire of London destroyed approximately 87 churches, 13,000 houses, and numerous businesses. It devastated iconic parts of the city, including the heart of the medieval London, the old Roman Wall, and many important governmental and commercial buildings. The total area burned spanned over 430 acres, and the fire's fury did not discriminate between the rich and the poor. It razed everything in its path: shops, homes, markets, and royal buildings alike. Despite the widespread destruction, the human cost of the fire was relatively low. It is estimated that fewer than 10 people died in the fire itself, though many more were injured, and the fire undoubtedly led to deaths in the aftermath due to disease and lack of shelter. The disaster was exacerbated by the fact that many people had lost everything they owned, and there were no immediate systems in place to provide relief. People sought refuge in open fields or the nearby countryside, where they camped in the open as the city's smouldering ruins began to cool. The fire also posed a significant threat to the city's economy. The markets, which were the lifeblood of London's commerce, were destroyed. As the flames swept through the city, traders lost their goods, and many businesses, from merchants to craftsmen, saw their livelihoods vanish in a matter of hours. London's economy was temporarily paralysed as it attempted to come to terms with the devastation. Yet in the midst of the destruction, the fire also sparked a transformation. The aftermath of the disaster gave Londoners the opportunity to rebuild their city, but it would also force them to confront deeper questions about how the city should be designed, how it should handle fire risks, and how it could recover from such a devastating blow. Immediate responses and efforts to control the fire. The response to the fire was slow, as London's firefighting techniques at the time were woefully inadequate. The city had no organised fire brigades, and firefighting methods were primitive at best. When a fire broke out, the standard response was to try to douse it with buckets of water, but this was ineffective against a fire of such scale. It was customary to use fire hooks to pull down buildings in the path of the fire, creating fire breaks, but in the dense, timber-heavy neighbourhoods of London, this tactic was not enough to stop the flames. By the time the fire reached the eastern part of the city, the authorities began to take more drastic measures. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was criticised for his slow response to the fire, as he initially dismissed the reports of the blaze and hesitated to take action. However, once the scale of the disaster became apparent, efforts were made to contain the fire. Soldiers were called in to help tear down buildings, and citizens worked together to create fire breaks in an attempt to stop the fire's spread. Despite their best efforts, the fire continued its devastating path. The flames were fueled by the wind, which carried embers across the city, igniting new fires. It wasn't until the wind died down that the fire finally began to lose its strength, and by September 6, the blaze was finally under control. However, the damage had already been done. The rebuilding of London. A new beginning. In the wake of the fire, London faced the monumental task of rebuilding. Though much of the city was in ruins, the disaster created an opportunity for transformation. King Charles II, who had only recently been restored to the throne after the English Civil War and the period of the Commonwealth, recognized the significance of the rebuilding effort. He appointed Sir Christopher Wren, an architect and mathematician, to lead the reconstruction of the city. The rebuilding effort was not just about restoring what had been lost, but also about improving the city's infrastructure and design. Wren's most famous contribution to the post-fire London was the redesign of St. Paul's Cathedral, a project that would take over 35 years to complete. However, Wren's vision extended beyond just churches. He proposed a new, more systematic layout for the city, with wider streets, more open spaces, and the introduction of new building codes to prevent future fires. The rebuilding of London was also marked by the introduction of brick and stone as primary building materials. Before the fire, many buildings in London were constructed from timber, which made them highly susceptible to fire. After the disaster, strict building regulations were put in place, requiring that new buildings be made of stone or brick. These measures helped make the city less vulnerable to future fires, and were part of a broader effort to create a safer and more sustainable urban environment. While the rebuilding process was slow and expensive, it ultimately transformed London into a more modern and organized city. The new London, with its redesigned streets, improved infrastructure, and fire-resistant buildings, stood as a testament to the resilience of the people who lived through the fire. It also marked the beginning of London's rise as a global commercial and cultural capital in the centuries that followed. Lessons learnt from the Great Fire. The Great Fire of London left an indelible mark on the city's history, not only in terms of the physical rebuilding that followed, but also in terms of the lessons it taught about urban planning, disaster response, and community resilience. The fire highlighted the dangers of overcrowded, poorly constructed urban areas, and exposed the inadequacy of firefighting efforts at the time. In response, new urban planning strategies were developed, and the city began to consider the long-term safety of its citizens. The fire also demonstrated the importance of coordinated disaster response and preparedness. While the fire itself was uncontrollable, the aftermath showed the value of organization and leadership in times of crisis. In the wake of the fire, London developed a more organized system of fire prevention and emergency response, including the establishment of fire brigades and the creation of fire breaks in case of future disasters. In many ways, the Great Fire of London serves as a reminder of the fragility of urban life and the resilience required to rebuild in the face of catastrophe. It is a story of destruction, yes, but also of renewal, adaptation, and the ability to rise from the ash. As we reflect on the impact of the Great Fire of London, we are left with a question: how can we apply the lessons learned from the fire and its aftermath to our own cities today, especially in the face of modern urban challenges such as climate change, population growth, and the risk of natural disasters? The aftermath and societal changes in the wake of the Great Fire. As the fire in London finally died down in early September of 1666, it left behind a city in ruins. Its streets, once filled with the vibrant activity of daily life, now smouldered in silence. The immediate task of extinguishing the flames was followed by the equally daunting challenge of dealing with the massive destruction left in the fire's wake. Yet, amid the rubble and ashes, a new phase of London's history began to unfold, one characterized not just by rebuilding, but by a shift in how the city's leaders and its citizens would approach governance, urban planning, and social organization. The immediate aftermath, relief and recovery. In the days following the fire, Londoners were left to reckon with the magnitude of the disaster. Over 13,000 homes had been destroyed, along with 87 churches, numerous public buildings, and a significant portion of the city's infrastructure. The fire had left tens of thousands of people homeless, and the destruction of businesses and markets disrupted the city's economy. The scale of the destruction was unprecedented, but so too was the sense of solidarity and resolve that emerged from the ashes. The first priority for both the monarchy and the citizens was to secure temporary shelter and provisions for those displaced. King Charles II, who had been in power for just a few years, took immediate action, providing relief to the victims of the fire. Temporary shelters are set up in the surrounding countryside, and provisions of food and money were distributed to those who had lost everything. The monarchy's response to the fire helped to stabilize the situation, providing both the resources and the sense of leadership that would be needed to guide the city through its recovery. However, while relief efforts helped to alleviate some of the immediate hardship, the true challenge was how to rebuild. It was clear that London could not simply restore itself to what it had been before the fire. The destruction had exposed the city's vulnerabilities, particularly its vulnerability to fire. London had been built with narrow streets and wooden houses, creating an environment that was highly susceptible to the rapid spread of flames. This realization led to profound changes in the way London was rebuilt and governed. Urban planning and the vision of a modern city. The task of rebuilding London fell into the hands of the city's leaders, including King Charles II and Sir Christopher Wren, who would become the most important figure in the city's reconstruction. Wren, a talented architect and mathematician, was appointed by the king to oversee the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the city's most important religious landmarks. However, Wren's vision went far beyond just the cathedral. He proposed a comprehensive plan for the entire city, one that would include wider streets, open spaces, and the use of more durable building materials. Wren's ideas for a new London were revolutionary. He recognized that the narrow, twisting streets of medieval London had made it impossible to combat fires effectively. His plan called for a grid-like street system that would improve both the flow of traffic and the ability to control fires. His designs also included wider streets, open public spaces, and parks, which would improve the city's overall livability. These principles of urban planning were ahead of their time, promoting a sense of order and functionality in a city that had previously been chaotic and cramped. Unfortunately, Wren's grand vision for a completely redesigned city was only partially realized. Due to financial constraints, political disagreements, and the sheer scale of the rebuilding process, not all of Wren's plans were implemented. Nevertheless, his work on St. Paul's Cathedral became a symbol of the city's resilience. The cathedral's construction, which took over 35 years to complete, became a focal point of the rebuilding effort and an enduring symbol of London's recovery. Beyond Wren's architectural plans, the rebuilding process also led to the introduction of new building regulations aimed at preventing future fires. The most significant of these was the requirement that all new buildings be constructed from brick or stone, rather than the timber that had so readily caught fire in the past. This shift in construction materials was crucial to making the city safer and more fire-resistant in the future. While Wren's designs for new streets and open spaces were only partially realized, his contributions to the rebuilding process laid the foundation for the modern city. His work helped to move London from a medieval haphazard collection of buildings into a more organized and resilient urban environment. The rebuilding of London was not just a physical reconstruction. It marked a shift in how the city thought about urban planning, public space, and disaster management. Social and economic changes. A new London. The Great Fire of London also had profound social and economic consequences. Before the fire, London had been a city characterized by social and economic stratification, with a large gap between the wealthy elites and the working poor. The fire, however, destroyed large portions of both the affluent areas and the poorer neighborhoods, creating a level of physical destruction that erased much of the city's social distinctions. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, the social divide between the classes appeared to have less. Wealthy landowners who had lost their homes were forced to take refuge in temporary shelters alongside the city's poorer residents, and the rebuilding process required cooperation from all sectors of society. However, the fire did not fundamentally alter the class structure of the city. Instead, it set in motion a series of economic and political changes that reinforced the social hierarchies of the time. Many of the wealthier landowners and businessmen, who had the means to rebuild quickly, took advantage of the opportunity to increase their holding. The rebuilding process saw the growth of wealthier, more exclusive neighborhoods, often centered around the newly constructed public spaces and streets that were designed by Wren. These areas were typically built in the modern style, with brick or stone houses, while the poorer neighborhoods were rebuilt in more traditional styles, often using cheaper, more flammable materials. The fire also had a significant impact on the economy of London. The destruction of markets, workshops, and stores disrupted trade and commerce, creating a temporary economic downturn. The rebuilding process, however, created new opportunities for business and trade. Builders, craftsmen, and labourers flooded the city to help with the reconstruction, and London became a magnet for entrepreneurs seeking to profit from the massive rebuilding effort. The fire had destroyed old markets and businesses, but the city's recovery helped to create new ones, and new industries began to emerge. The rebuilding process was slow, but by the late 1670s, London had begun to recover. The city's economy gradually stabilised, and its position as a commercial and financial centre began to be restored. However, the lessons learned from the fire had a lasting impact on London's development. The fire reinforced the importance of urban planning, the need for fire prevention, and the value of resilient infrastructure. The Great Fire's legacy, a symbol of resilience. As the years passed, the Great Fire of London became a symbol of both tragedy and triumph. The immediate destruction caused by the fire was devastating, but the city's recovery showcased the resilience and determination of its people. London emerged from the ashes as a stronger, more modern city, equipped with new systems of governance, urban planning, and disaster management. The fire also had a lasting impact on the collective memory of the city. Over time, it became an event commemorated in art, literature, and public discourse, shaping the identity of London as a city that could withstand even the most catastrophic events. The rebuilding of the city, though slow and arduous, became a metaphor for the strength and endurance of its people. Today, the Great Fire of London serves as a reminder of the fragility of urban life and the importance of resilience in the face of disaster. The lessons learned from the fire and the subsequent rebuilding process continue to inform urban planning, disaster preparedness, and the way cities manage growth and change. In many ways, the fire marked the end of one era of London's history and the beginning of another, one defined by modernity, order, and a renewed sense of purpose. As we reflect on the legacy of the Great Fire, we are left with a thought-provoking question. In the face of modern challenges such as climate change, natural disasters, and urban overcrowding, what lessons can we learn from London's response to one of the most devastating events in its history? The Great Fire's lasting influence on modern urbanism and disaster preparedness. The Great Fire of London in 1666 was more than just a devastating disaster. It was a transformative event that reshaped the city both physically and culturally. The fire, which swept through much of London, laid bare the flaws in medieval urban planning and exposed the city's vulnerability to both fire and poor infrastructure. However, the aftermath of the fire set in motion a series of changes that would influence the trajectory of urban development, disaster management, and fire safety not just in London but across the world. As the city rebuilt itself from the ashes, it became a model for future urban planning and a symbol of resilience in the face of catastrophe. The rebuilding of London, a model for urban planning. In the aftermath of the fire, the task of rebuilding London was no small feat. The city, which had been constructed using timber, lacked the infrastructure needed to protect it from the spread of fires. The narrow, winding streets, combined with the densely packed buildings, allowed the flames to spread rapidly. It became clear that a new approach to urban planning was needed, one that would ensure the city's long-term survival and growth. King Charles II, recognizing the gravity of the situation, appointed Sir Christopher Wren to oversee the reconstruction of St. Paul's Cathedral, the most iconic structure to have been destroyed by the fire. Wren, an accomplished architect and scientist, had a vision for the city that extended beyond just rebuilding individual buildings. He proposed a bold plan to redesign London, creating wider streets and more open spaces to reduce the risk of future fires and make the city more navigable. Wren's ideas were revolutionary for their time. His plans included a more orderly street grid, with broad, straight roads that could allow for better fire breaks and quicker access for fire brigades. He also proposed a system of public squares and open spaces that would give the city a more modern, accessible feel. Wren's influence on the city's design can still be seen today in the structure of London's streets and its public spaces. Though not all of Wren's grand designs were realised due to financial constraints and political challenges, his vision of a more organised, fire-resistant city left a lasting imprint on urban planning. One of the most enduring legacies of Wren's work was the introduction of fire-resistant materials for construction. Before the fire, most buildings in London were made of timber, which made the city highly vulnerable to fire. After the disaster, brick and stone became the dominant materials in construction, This shift not only made the buildings more durable, but also helped to mitigate the risk of future fire. The fire also prompted new regulations on building height, street width, and the materials used for construction, which are still in place in many parts of London today. The fire had inadvertently spurred a revolution in building codes and urban design, one that prioritized safety, accessibility, and resilience. Fire safety and the birth of modern firefighting. The Great Fire of London also marked the beginning of significant changes in how cities approached fire safety and firefighting. Before the fire, firefighting in London was a rudimentary process. Fire brigades were not formally organised, and firefighting methods were largely ineffective against large-scale fires. In the face of the Great Fire, the city's residents were forced to improvise, using primitive tools like fire hooks to pull down buildings and create fire breaks. Water was poured from buckets, but this was insufficient against the magnitude of the fire. In the wake of the disaster, the need for a more systematic approach to fire safety became evident. In the years following the fire, London saw the establishment of the first official fire brigade. The fire watchers, who had previously been volunteers, began to be organised into more formalised groups, tasked with monitoring and extinguishing fires. This was the beginning of the modern fire service, though it would take decades for firefighting techniques to become fully professional. Another important development was the creation of fire insurance, which became increasingly popular in the aftermath of the Great Fire. Property owners sought to protect their assets from future fires, and insurance companies began offering coverage against fire damage. This led to the establishment of fire insurance companies and the creation of organised fire brigades that would respond to fires in insured properties. Fire insurance and the fire brigade system helped to further professionalise the response to urban disasters. These changes laid the foundation for modern fire safety practices. Over time, as urbanisation accelerated in the centuries following the fire, cities worldwide adopted similar practices, from fire regulations to organised fire departments. The fire of 1666 served as a crucial turning point in fire safety, as it prompted cities to re-evaluate their approach to disaster management and to take proactive steps to prevent and mitigate the effects of future fires. The social and psychological impact of the Great Fire. While the physical rebuilding of the city was underway, the psychological and social impact of the Great Fire was far-reaching. For those who lived through the disaster, the experience of losing their homes, businesses, and communities was traumatic. The sense of loss and uncertainty in the immediate aftermath was overwhelming. People who had once called the heart of London their home were now displaced, living in temporary shelters or out in the countryside. The Great Fire also led to a significant shift in how Londoners viewed their cities. The destruction of so much of the city's historic fabric, including its churches, markets, and government buildings, prompted a re-evaluation of what it meant to be a Londoner. The fire also reinforced a sense of community resilience. Despite the overwhelming loss, the city's residents began to rebuild, and the shared experience of recovery helped to forge a new sense of identity. The people of London, coming together to rebuild their city, found strength in their unity and their ability to overcome adversity. In the years following the fire, Londoners looked back at the disaster not just as a catastrophe but as a transformative event that marked the city's resilience and its ability to rebuild from the ground up. The fire became a symbol of the city's capacity for renewal, and its memory lived on as both a warning and a testament to the power of communal effort. For the monarchy, the rebuilding of London provided an opportunity to strengthen its control over the city. The fire had revealed the inadequacies of local governance, and in the wake of the disaster, King Charles II took a more active role in overseeing the rebuilding process. The monarchy's leadership during this time helped solidify its authority in a city that had been shaken by both the fire and the plague. The fire also prompted the development of stronger city governance, with more coordinated planning and regulation of urban development legacy. The evolution of modern urbanism. The Great Fire of London, while catastrophic, had a lasting impact on urban development and city planning around the world. The fire exposed the vulnerabilities of medieval cities, overcrowded, poorly constructed and lacking in modern infrastructure, and set in motion a process of urban renewal that would shape the development of cities for centuries. The lessons learned from the fire were applied not just in London but in cities across Europe and beyond. The fire led to a new focus on urban planning, including the development of fire breaks, wider streets, and more resilient building material. It also led to the creation of public spaces and parks, which became central to modern urban design. Over time, these innovations would give rise to the city as we know it today, organized, regulated, and more resilient in the face of disaster. The Great Fire of London also served as a reminder of the fragility of cities. In an era of rapid urbanization, the fire underscored the importance of disaster preparedness and fire safety, lessons that remain relevant today as cities around the world face new challenges such as climate change, overpopulation, and the risk of natural disaster. As we reflect on the legacy of the Great Fire of London, it prompts us to ask, how have our modern cities learned from the disasters of the past, and how can we ensure that the cities of tomorrow are resilient in the face of the challenges ahead? The fall of the Aztec Empire, the conquest of an ancient civilization, the rise of the Aztec Empire, and the Age of Glory. In the early 15th century, nestled in the heart of what is now Mexico, a powerful and sophisticated civilization was rising, one that would become known as the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs, or Mexico as they called themselves, established their empire in a region already rich in culture, religion, and history. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 16th century, the Aztec Empire was at its zenith, spanning much of central Mexico, with its capital city, Tenochtitlan, a marvel of engineering and urban planning. The Aztec civilization was built upon centuries of Mesoamerican culture, including the Olmec, Maya, and Toltec civilizations. While the Aztecs were relatively new in comparison to their ancient predecessors, they quickly consolidated power through military conquest and strategic alliances. The Mexica people had settled in the area around Lake Texcoco, where they founded their city, Tenochtitlan. According to Aztec legend, the gods had instructed them to settle on the spot where they saw an eagle perched on a cactus with a snake in its beak, a symbol that today is part of Mexico's national emblem. Tenochtitlan, an island city, was an engineering marvel. The city was connected to the mainland by causeways and had a complex system of canals that allowed for transportation and trade. The Aztecs built impressive pyramids and temples, the most famous of which was the Templo Maya, dedicated to their gods Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, and Tlaloc, the god of rain. The city had a population of around 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Aztec society was highly structured and stratified. At the top was the emperor, who was considered the earthly representative of the gods. The emperor, or Huitzilopochtli, was not only a political leader, but also a spiritual one, responsible for maintaining the divine favor of the gods. Beneath the emperor were the nobles, priests, and warriors, who formed the elite class. The majority of the population were commoners, farmers, artisans, and merchants, who were responsible for producing food and goods. At the bottom were slaves, who were often prisoners of war, or individuals who had fallen into debt. Religion played an integral role in Aztec society. The Aztecs believed that the gods required regular offerings to maintain the balance of the universe, and these offerings were often in the form of sacrifices. The Aztec practice of human sacrifice is one of the most well-known aspects of their culture, though it has often been exaggerated. It is estimated that the Aztecs performed thousands of sacrifices annually, mainly captured prisoners of war, to ensure the sun would rise each day, and to maintain cosmic order. In addition to their religious devotion, the Aztecs were skilled in many areas, including agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and art. They developed a system of writing, known as Nahuatl, and a calendar system that was more advanced than that of many other civilizations of the time. They also built a sophisticated system of trade, using cacao beans as currency and maintaining an extensive network of markets. However, despite their achievements, the Aztecs were not without their enemies. The Mexica made enemies during their rapid expansion, and the rise of their empire was built on the back of militaristic conquest. Their dominance in Mesoamerica relied on the tribute they extracted from other regions, and while they formed alliances with some neighboring peoples, their aggressive tactics and demands for tribute created resentment among others. By the time the Spanish arrived in the early 1500s, the Aztec Empire was a force to be reckoned with, powerful, wealthy, and sophisticated, but it was also vulnerable, not just due to external enemies, but because of its own internal weaknesses. While the empire had vast resources, a strong military, and complex social and religious structures, it also faced challenges such as the pressure of maintaining dominance over conquered peoples and the growing resentment of those who were forced into submission. It was into this complex and vibrant world that Hernán Cortés and his Spanish conquistadors would enter in 1519, altering the course of history in a way no one could have predicted. The encounter, initial contact and tensions. Hernán Cortés, a Spanish conquistador from the Caribbean, arrived on the shores of what is now Mexico in 1519, with an expeditionary force of around 600 men, along with horses, cannons and firearms, new and terrifying technologies for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Cortés and his men, as well as the indigenous allies they brought with them, would soon face the Aztec Empire and its ruler, Montezuma II. Initially, the Aztecs had no knowledge of the approaching Spanish forces. Cortés, an ambitious and charismatic leader, made contact with local tribes and began to form alliances with them. These alliances were essential, as many of the tribes had been subjugated by the Aztecs and were eager to find a way to break free from their domination. One of the most important alliances was with the Tlaxcalans, a fierce and independent tribe that had long been enemies of the Aztecs. The political situation in the Aztec Empire was complex. Montezuma II, the emperor, was an intelligent but cautious ruler who was aware of the potential threat the Spanish posed. The Aztecs had heard of strange men arriving on horseback from the east, and Montezuma, who had a deep religious belief in omens, may have seen the arrival of the Spanish as a sign of divine prophecy. There were rumors that Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent god, would one day return from the east to reclaim power, and some have speculated that Montezuma may have thought that Cortés and his men were the fulfillment of that prophecy. Despite the initial confusion, Montezuma allowed Cortés and his men to enter Tenochtitlan peacefully. In one of the most significant encounters in history, Cortés and Montezuma met in the city, and Montezuma, with great formality, welcomed Cortés as a guest. However, tensions quickly began to build. Cortés, recognizing the opportunity to gain power, began to exploit Montezuma's hesitations. He and his men began to demand gold and riches from the Aztec ruler, and tensions between the Spanish and the Aztecs began to grow. Would Cortés succeed in his pursuit of wealth and power? Would Montezuma be able to maintain control of his empire as these foreign invaders encroached on his capital? Betrayal and the siege of Tenochtitlan. As Hernán Cortés and his men grew in strength and influence within the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, the relationship between the Spanish conquistadors and the Aztec Emperor Montezuma II became increasingly tense. What had begun as a peaceful encounter, with Cortés entering the grand city with the blessings of Montezuma, quickly descended into a volatile standoff. Cortés, though a guest within Montezuma's magnificent palace, had no intention of returning the hospitality. His motives were clear: conquest, riches, and power. Montezuma, meanwhile, found himself caught between his role as a spiritual leader and ruler of the Aztec Empire and the strange, terrifying presence of the Spanish. His hesitations may have been influenced by the deep spiritual beliefs that governed Aztec society, including the idea that their gods would return in some form. He might have believed that the arrival of the Spanish was a divine omen, though the precise nature of his thoughts remains unclear. But as time passed and Cortés's demands became more aggressive, it became apparent that the emperor's welcoming approach was beginning to backfire. Cortés, meanwhile, had already readied his own plans. He sought to take advantage of the fear and discontent that existed among the various tributary states that had been subjugated by the Aztec Empire. He knew that by exploiting the resentment of these peoples, particularly the Tlaxcalans, he could strengthen his force. With the aid of local allies, Cortés was able to secure reinforcements, giving him a much-needed edge over the Aztec forces. These allies, previously enemies of the Aztecs, were motivated by their desire to overthrow the powerful empire that had long held them under its thumb. They were eager to help Cortés in his mission to topple Montezuma and the Aztec regime. On the night of June 30, 1520, the situation in Tenochtitlan took a dramatic turn for the worse. The Spanish, having grown bolder in their demands, seized Montezuma as a hostage. The emperor, who had allowed Cortés and his men into his city, was now a prisoner in his own palace. This action marked a pivotal moment in the conquest. For Montezuma, it was the beginning of the end. By this point, he was under intense pressure. His leadership was being questioned both by his people and by the Spanish, who sought more and more gold and power. The massacre at the Great Temple, The capture of Montezuma sparked a series of tragic events that would change the fate of the Aztec Empire. As tensions rose within the city, Cortés's position became precarious. Montezuma's continued imprisonment and the Spanish occupation of Tenochtitlan led to growing unrest among the Aztecs. The citizens of the city began to view the Spanish as invaders, and a fierce resistance began to grow. It was during this time that Cortés was forced to make a brutal decision. In what would become one of the most infamous events of the conquest, Cortés ordered a massacre in the Templo Mayor, the grand temple in the heart of Tenochtitlan. On the night of May 22, 1520, while Montezuma remained in captivity, Cortés's forces attacked a large gathering of Aztec nobles and priests who had assembled to celebrate a religious festival. Spanish soldiers slaughtered scores of unarmed civilians, a brutal act that enraged the Aztec population and left the city on the brink of revolt. The massacre was a clear signal that the Spanish had no interest in diplomacy or peace. They wanted total control. This massacre, now known as the Noche Triste, or the Night of Sorrows, set off a chain reaction. The people of Tenochtitlan, already suspicious of Cortés and his motives, were now determined to rid their city of the invaders. The massacre, combined with the growing resistance from local tribes, marked the beginning of the end for Cortés's tenuous control over Tenochtitlan. The situation rapidly deteriorated, and the Aztecs launched an assault on the Spanish forces. At this point, the Spanish found themselves trapped in Montezuma's palace, unable to escape. As the fighting grew more intense, Cortés's forces were forced to flee the city, but not without great loss. The Aztecs, led by Montezuma's successor, Cuitlahuac, who had taken over as emperor after Montezuma's death, unleashed a fierce counterattack that severely weakened the Spanish. In the early hours of the morning, as the Spanish attempted to make their retreat, they were ambushed by the Aztec forces, and many of Cortés's men were killed or captured. The retreat was a chaotic and bloody affair, with Cortés losing many soldiers and much of his treasure. The loss marked the turning point in the conflict. Cortés and his forces had been humbled, and the conquest of Tenochtitlan seemed uncertain. Yet, the battle was far from over. The return and the siege of Tenochtitlan. Despite the setback, Cortés was not finished. His retreat from Tenochtitlan would be followed by his return with reinforcements. Cortés had lost the battle, but he had not lost the war. In the months following the retreat, Cortés gathered an army of both Spanish soldiers and indigenous allies, including the Tlaxcalans, who had suffered under Aztec rule and were eager to help defeat the empire. The Aztec Empire, meanwhile, was facing internal instability. The death of Montezuma, possibly due to illness or poisoning, left a power vacuum. His successor, Cuitlahuac, led the defense of Tenochtitlan, but his reign was short-lived, as he succumbed to smallpox, a disease that the Spanish had unwittingly brought with them. The arrival of smallpox proved to be a decisive factor in the conquest. The disease decimated the indigenous population, including many of the warriors who had fought to protect Tenochtitlan. The spread of smallpox was not deliberate, but its devastating impact on the Aztecs weakened their ability to resist. The city, already besieged by food shortages, starvation and war, found itself further incapacitated by this invisible enemy. By the time Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan in 1521, the empire was already in a state of disarray. The Spanish, along with their indigenous allies, launched a full-scale siege on the city. The siege lasted for several months, during which the Aztecs fought fiercely but were outmatched by the Spanish forces and their superior weaponry, including firearms and cannons. The city's food supplies were exhausted, and starvation took a heavy toll on the defenders. Despite the Aztecs' best efforts to defend their city, their resources dwindled, and the once great Tenochtitlan was brought to its knees. On August 13, 1521, after nearly 3 months of intense fighting, Cortés and his forces finally captured the capital city. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the end of the Aztec Empire and the beginning of Spanish control over much of Mesoamerica. The city was destroyed, and what had once been the center of the Aztec world was transformed into a Spanish colonial outpost. The aftermath, the end of the Aztec Empire. The conquest of the Aztec Empire was complete, but the consequences were far-reaching. The fall of Tenochtitlan led to the eventual collapse of the Aztec social, political, and religious system. The Spanish imposed their own culture, religion, and governance on the region, converting the indigenous people to Christianity and dismantling many of the Aztec tradition. The once great civilization of the Aztecs, with its complex system of tribute, its impressive cities, and its rich cultural heritage, was replaced by the colonial structures of Spanish rule. Yet, the legacy of the Aztecs would live on. Elements of their culture, from their agricultural techniques to their art and architecture, influenced the development of colonial Mexico. The impact of the conquest also shaped the relationship between European powers and the indigenous peoples of the Americas for centuries to come, setting the stage for the broader colonial era that would follow. In reflecting on the fall of the Aztec Empire, a key question remains: how much of the Aztec downfall was due to external factors, such as disease and superior weaponry, versus the internal fragility of an empire built on conquest and tribute? What lessons can be drawn from this monumental moment in history, not only for understanding the rise and fall of empires, but also for the way in which cultures clash and interact in the face of new and often overwhelming forces? The long-term consequences of the conquest and the legacy of the Aztecs. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, and the subsequent collapse of the Aztec Empire, marked one of the most significant turning points in the history of the Americas. The conquest, led by Hernán Cortés, was a complex and multifaceted event, shaped by a combination of military strategy, technological superiority, disease and internal instability within the Aztec Empire. While the immediate consequences were the destruction of a powerful empire and the establishment of Spanish colonial rule, the long-term effects of the conquest reached far beyond the fall of Tenochtitlan. The end of the Aztec Empire, a new era begins. Following the capture of Tenochtitlan, Hernán Cortés set about securing Spanish rule in the region. The Aztec Empire, once the most powerful political and military force in Mesoamerica, was dismantled, and the region was absorbed into the Spanish Empire. The city of Tenochtitlan was repurposed, with much of the old city destroyed and Spanish colonial buildings and churches constructed in their place. The Templo Mayor, the central religious temple of the Aztecs, was torn down, and in its place the Spanish built a cathedral to signify the dominance of Christianity over the ancient Aztec religion. The destruction of the city, the heart of the Aztec Empire, was symbolic of the broader cultural transformation that was taking place. The Spanish sought not only to conquer the land but also to reshape the lives of the indigenous people through forced conversions to Christianity, the imposition of European governance, and the eradication of Aztec religious practices. The fall of the Aztec Empire, however, was not the end of the indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica. While the empire was dismantled, the Aztec civilization's impact did not disappear overnight. Many aspects of Aztec culture persisted in various forms despite the destruction of their political power. The traditions of the Mexica people, from their agricultural practices to their art, music and language, continued to influence the region long after the conquest. Disease, the invisible weapon that decimated the Aztecs. One of the most significant and tragic factors in the fall of the Aztec Empire was the spread of European diseases, especially smallpox, which arrived with the Spanish conquistadors. These diseases had devastating effects on the indigenous population, to the extent that some estimates suggest that as much as 90% of the population in some areas died due to diseases introduced by the Europeans. Smallpox was the most lethal of these diseases, and its effects were catastrophic. The Aztecs had no natural immunity to European diseases, and the rapid spread of smallpox throughout Tenochtitlan devastated the population. The disease spread so quickly that it killed thousands of Aztecs in a matter of weeks, leaving many vulnerable and disrupting the Aztec social and military structure. While the Spanish soldiers had the advantage of superior weaponry and tactics, it was the invisible force of disease that proved to be the most effective weapon in defeating the Aztec Empire. The widespread death caused by smallpox, along with other diseases like measles and influenza, undermined the Aztecs' ability to resist the Spanish. The disease weakened the empire's leadership, as key figures such as Emperor Cuitlahuac succumbed to smallpox, leaving the Aztec people without strong leadership during a crucial period of resistance. The social fabric of Aztec society began to unravel, and the power vacuum left by the death of the leadership further compounded the challenges faced by the Aztecs. The cultural transformation, Christianity and colonialism. The Spanish conquest did not only destroy the Aztec political and military structure, but also set in motion the cultural transformation of Mesoamerica. One of the most profound changes was the introduction of Christianity. The Spanish, under the guise of spreading religion, imposed Catholicism upon the indigenous populations. Temples were torn down, and churches were built in their place, symbolizing the dominance of the Catholic faith over the ancient spiritual practices of the Aztec. The forced conversion of the indigenous people to Christianity was not a smooth process. Many Aztecs resisted the imposition of foreign beliefs, and some even secretly continued to practice their old religions. However, the Catholic Church, with the support of the Spanish crown, was highly effective in its efforts to convert the indigenous population. Missionaries established missions throughout the region, and over time Catholicism became deeply entrenched in the culture of New Spain, as the Spanish colony was called. The syncretism of Aztec beliefs with Catholicism led to the creation of a unique religious and cultural fusion, evident in the religious practices and festivals that still persist in Mexican culture today. The imposition of Spanish colonial rule also meant the introduction of a new social system. The Spanish crown established the encomienda system, which allowed Spanish settlers to receive land and labor from indigenous people in exchange for protection and the spread of Christianity. This system effectively enslaved large numbers of indigenous people, forcing them to work in harsh conditions on plantations or in mines. The Spanish also introduced a feudal-like system of land ownership, which created a sharp divide between the European colonizers and the indigenous people. The legacy of the Aztecs in the modern world. While the Aztec Empire was destroyed by the Spanish conquest, its legacy lives on in many aspects of modern Mexican culture. The Aztec language, Nahuatl, is still spoken by around 1.5 million people today, and many words from Nahuatl have been absorbed into the Spanish spoken in Mexico. Traditional Aztec cuisine, such as tortillas, tamales, and the use of corn as a staple, remains central to Mexican food culture. The Aztecs also left behind a rich artistic and architectural legacy. The ruins of the Templo Mayor, rediscovered in the 1970s, provide a glimpse into the grandeur of Aztec civilization. Aztec art, particularly their intricate stone carvings, pottery, and jewelry, continues to inspire artists today. The symbolic imagery of the Aztecs, including their famous depiction of the eagle and snake, has become a national emblem of Mexico. Moreover, the Aztecs contributed to advancements in agriculture, particularly in the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash, which are still the cornerstone of traditional farming in the region. Their knowledge of irrigation, crop rotation, and the use of chinampas, floating gardens, to maximize agricultural output was advanced for its time and remains a part of the agricultural heritage of central Mexico. The fall of the Aztec Empire is not just a story of conquest, but also a story of adaptation, survival, and cultural resilience. Despite the destruction of their political power, the Aztecs left an indelible mark on the history of the Americas. Their legacy lives on in the language, art, food, and traditions of modern Mexico, as well as in the way the world views the consequences of colonialism. Reflection: the intersection of cultures and the cost of conquest. As we reflect on the fall of the Aztec Empire, we are reminded of the profound and often painful impact of colonial encounters. The Aztec Empire, with its sophisticated systems of governance, religion, and culture, was decimated in a matter of years. The story of the Aztecs is a story of a great civilization meeting its end through an of external conquest, disease, and the forces of change brought on by the arrival of Europeans. The question remains, how much of the Aztec Empire's downfall was due to the external forces brought by the Spanish, and how much of it was due to internal factors, such as political fragmentation and resentment among subjugated people? How did the intersection of cultures, both violent and collaborative, shape the world we know today, particularly in the Americas? The fall of the Aztecs serves as a reminder of the complexities of colonial history, where the legacies of ancient civilizations continue to influence the modern world in ways both seen and unseen. The fall of Constantinople, the last days of the Byzantine Empire. The rise and decline of Constantinople. The city of Constantinople was for centuries the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, the most powerful and enduring successor to the Roman Empire. Strategically positioned at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, it was a hub of trade, culture, and politics, a symbol of imperial grandeur. The city's position on the shores of the Bosporus, along with its massive walls, made it nearly impregnable. For over a millennium, Constantinople had stood as the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, a beacon of Christian civilization in a world that was often divided by religious, cultural, and political turmoil. Founded in 330 AD by Emperor Constantine the Great, the city quickly became the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, and later, the Byzantine Empire. Under the leadership of Constantine, the city was transformed into an imperial center, with magnificent structures, including the Hagia Sophia, a vast cathedral that would stand as a symbol of Byzantine architectural brilliance. Its golden mosaics, grand domes, and towering minarets would later define the cultural legacy of the empire. For centuries, Constantinople flourished, fending off external threats and preserving the legacy of the Roman Empire. However, by the late 14th century, the Byzantine Empire was a mere shadow of its former self. The once mighty empire had been steadily shrinking, losing territories to the advancing Ottoman Empire. Internal strife, economic difficulties, and the military pressure from the Ottoman Turks had taken their toll on the empire's strength and influence. The decline of Constantinople was not sudden, nor was it solely due to external threats. While the Ottomans were certainly a looming threat, the Byzantine Empire was also weakened by internal corruption, political instability, and divisions within the ruling class. The city, once a vibrant metropolis, had also suffered economically, as its markets and trade routes became increasingly controlled by outside powers. As the empire's power dwindled, so did the strength of the city that had once stood as its beating heart. By the 15th century, Constantinople was surrounded by Ottoman forces, and its defenses had grown weaker. The once mighty walls, which had repelled invaders for centuries, could no longer protect the city from the advancing Turkish army. The Byzantine rulers, particularly Emperor Constantinus Papaliodagos, were well aware that the empire's survival was at stake. Despite their best efforts, the city's fall seemed inevitable. The Ottoman Empire, the rising power. The Ottoman Empire, which had been steadily growing in strength and influence since the 14th century, was led by Sultan Mehmed II, known as Mehmed the Conqueror. By 1453, Mehmed had already established Ottoman dominance over much of the Balkans and Anatolia, and he had set his sights on the ultimate prize, Constantinople. Mehmed understood that the conquest of Constantinople would not only bring an end to the Byzantine Empire, but would also cement his status as one of history's great conquerors. Mehmed's preparations for the siege of Constantinople were meticulous. He assembled a massive army, estimated to be between 80,000 and 100,000 men, along with a fleet of warships. The Ottomans also employed new military technologies, including massive cannons capable of battering down the city's formidable wall. The Byzantine defenders, in contrast, numbered around 7,000 men, and while they were skilled and determined, they were vastly outnumbered and outmatched. The Ottomans also understood the strategic value of Constantinople. The city's location, perched between two continents and controlling vital trade routes, made it a key geopolitical prize. By capturing Constantinople, the Ottomans would not only weaken their enemies, but also gain access to the wealth of the Mediterranean and control over key trade routes to Europe and Asia. For Mehmed, the conquest of Constantinople was both a military and symbolic goal, securing the future of the Ottoman Empire and establishing himself as the rightful heir to the legacy of Rome. As the siege of Constantinople began, the Byzantine defenders were caught between a rock and a hard place. The Byzantine Empire had few allies left, and the pleas for help sent to Western Europe went largely unanswered. The Catholic powers, still embroiled in their own struggles, were unable or unwilling to provide significant assistance to the embattled Byzantines. Pope Nicholas V even offered to send military aid, but his efforts were too little, too late. The Byzantine Empire, once the bulwark of Christianity in the East, was now isolated, and its fate was in the hands of its defenders. The siege begins. The Ottoman assault. On April 6, 1453, Mehmed II's forces began their siege of Constantinople, encircling the city with a formidable army. The Byzantine defenders, led by Emperor Constantine Elephant, knew that they were vastly outnumbered, and that the walls of Constantinople, once thought impregnable, would soon be tested. Despite the odds, the city's defenders fought with determination and resolve, knowing that the fall of the city would mean the end of their empire. Mehmed's army included a diverse range of troops, from elite janissaries to light cavalry. The siege was not just a military endeavor, it was a psychological one. Mehmed understood that breaking the morale of the defenders would be just as important as breaking the walls. He set up a blockade around the city, cutting off vital supplies and communications with the outside world. The Byzantines, already stretched thin, faced increasing starvation and dwindling resources. One of the most innovative aspects of Mehmed's siege was his use of heavy artillery, particularly massive cannons. These cannons were capable of launching huge stones at the city's walls, causing significant damage. The Byzantine defences, though formidable, could not withstand the constant barrage. The Ottoman forces, aided by the use of these new weapons, were able to breach the city's ancient fortifications and make significant inroads into the city. As the siege dragged on for weeks, the defenders of Constantinople held strong. The city's walls, built by Emperor Theodosius II in the 5th century, had withstood countless attacks over the centuries. However, the sheer size and power of the Ottoman cannons proved too much for them. On May 22, 1453, after weeks of bombardment, a section of the wall near the gate of St. Romanus finally collapsed, allowing the Ottoman forces to breach the city's defences. The final assault on the city was brutal. The Ottomans poured into Constantinople, overwhelming the defenders and storming the city in a ferocious onslaught. The Byzantine soldiers fought valiantly but were no match for the Ottomans' superior numbers and firepower. Emperor Constantine XI, who had led the defence with courage, was last seen fighting in the streets, but he ultimately perished in the chaos. The city fell. The fall of Constantinople, the end of an era. The fall of Constantinople on May 29, 1453, marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and the conclusion of the Roman Empire's 1500-year history. It was a cataclysmic event, not only for the Byzantines but for the entire Christian world. The city, which had once been the heart of Christianity in the East, was now in the hands of the Ottomans, and its name was changed to Istanbul. The impact of the fall of Constantinople reverberated throughout Europe. The loss of the city marked the end of an era of Christian dominance in the East, and the Ottomans' control over Constantinople gave them access to the trade routes between Europe and Asia. The Ottoman Empire's influence grew substantially in the years following the conquest, and the city of Istanbul would become the heart of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. For the Western world, the fall of Constantinople was a devastating blow. The loss of the city severed the link between the Byzantine Empire and the West, and the Christian world was now divided. The fall also sparked a series of changes in trade routes, prompting European nations to seek alternative routes to Asia, eventually leading to the Age of Exploration. The cultural loss was immense. Constantinople had been a center of learning, art, and architecture. The loss of the city meant the loss of invaluable texts, including ancient Greek and Roman manuscripts that had been preserved by the Byzantines. These texts would not be rediscovered by Western scholars until the Renaissance, which followed in the wake of the Ottoman conquest. The fall of Constantinople, therefore, was not just the fall of a city, it was the fall of an entire civilization. As we reflect on the fall of Constantinople, the question arises, how did the loss of this great city shape the course of history, and what lessons can be drawn from the resilience of the Byzantines, who fought to preserve their empire until the very end? The cultural and religious consequences of the fall of Constantinople. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was not just a military defeat, it had profound cultural, religious, and geopolitical consequences that would ripple throughout the centuries. For the Byzantines, the loss of their capital city meant the end of their empire and the tragic collapse of a civilization that had existed for over 1,000 years. Yet for the Ottomans it represented a significant victory, expanding their empire into Europe and securing their position as a dominant force in the Eastern Mediterranean. Beyond the immediate political fallout, the fall of Constantinople also marked a significant turning point in the history of Christianity, art, knowledge, and trade. It would shape the course of both the European Renaissance and the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. The end of the Byzantine Empire, a cultural loss. The fall of Constantinople marked the official end of the Byzantine Empire, an empire that had been the eastern leg of the Roman Empire for over 1,000 years. The Byzantines had preserved Roman law, culture, and Christianity, passing these traditions down through the centuries despite facing countless invasions both from barbarian tribes and more recent Islamic empire. The loss of Constantinople was not just the fall of a city, it was the loss of a way of life. Constantinople had been the center of Byzantine Christianity and culture. The city's intellectual and artistic achievements were remarkable, from the preservation of classical Greek and Roman texts to the development of Christian theology and Byzantine art. When the Ottomans conquered the city, they did not just destroy its buildings, they also gained access to the vast cultural wealth that had accumulated in Constantinople. Libraries, monasteries, and churches contained thousands of manuscripts, some of which were irreplaceable. These included classical Greek works, many of which had been preserved by the Byzantines but were lost to much of Western Europe until later rediscovery. The loss of these texts and the destruction of religious centers in Constantinople was a significant blow to the cultural heritage of both the Byzantine Empire and the Christian world. While many intellectuals, monks and scholars fled the city, taking important texts with them to the west, the city itself was reduced to a shadow of its former glory. Ottoman forces converted many of the city's churches into mosques, most famously the Hagia Sophia, which was transformed into one of the grandest mosques of the Ottoman Empire. The migration of scholars, the Renaissance's rebirth. Despite the great tragedy of the fall, one of the more unexpected consequences of the conquest was the migration of Byzantine scholars to the west. As the Ottomans took control of Constantinople, many Byzantine intellectuals, including philosophers, scientists, and religious scholars, fled the city, bringing with them priceless manuscripts, knowledge, and tradition. The exodus of these scholars played a significant role in sparking the Italian Renaissance. The Renaissance, which began in Italy in the 14th century, saw a renewed interest in classical knowledge, particularly in Greek and Roman art, literature, and philosophy. However, it was not until the fall of Constantinople that Western Europe gained direct access to the ancient Greek texts that had been preserved by the Byzantines. As scholars fled to Italy and other European cities, they brought with them works by Aristotle, Plato, and other Greek philosophers, many of which had been lost to the West for centuries. This influx of knowledge helped ignite the intellectual curiosity that characterized the Renaissance and laid the foundation for the scientific and cultural advancements that followed. One of the most notable figures to flee Constantinople was the scholar and philosopher George Gemistus Plethon, who brought with him manuscripts of ancient Greek writings that would later influence Renaissance thinkers. The arrival of these scholars in Europe helped to reintroduce classical antiquity to the West, stimulating the study of Greek, Latin, and philosophy, and fostering the humanist ideals that defined the Renaissance. Without the fall of Constantinople and the migration of its scholars, the Renaissance might not have unfolded as it did. The knowledge of the ancient world, preserved by the Byzantines, played a critical role in reviving European culture and advancing scientific and artistic thought. Religious consequences. The end of Eastern Orthodox dominance. The fall of Constantinople also marked the end of the Eastern Orthodox Church's dominance in the Christian world. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had been the heart of Orthodox Christianity, and the city of Constantinople was home to the ecumenical patriarch, the spiritual leader of the Orthodox Christian world. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople had significant religious ramifications, both for the Orthodox Church and for the broader Christian world. After the conquest, the Ottomans imposed their rule over the city, but they also allowed the Orthodox Church to continue to function under Ottoman supervision. Mehmed, the Ottoman Sultan, allowed the Orthodox Church to maintain a degree of autonomy within the empire, recognizing the Patriarch of Constantinople as the leader of the Orthodox Christians in the empire. However, this autonomy came with a price. The Orthodox Church was now subject to Ottoman control, and the Patriarch's power was limited to the religious sphere rather than the political. This arrangement marked a significant shift in the balance of power within the Christian world. The Eastern Orthodox Church, once the dominant Christian force in the Eastern Mediterranean, was now under the control of the Ottoman. The fall of Constantinople and the rise of Ottoman rule signified the weakening of Orthodox Christianity's political power, while Catholicism in the West continued to thrive, particularly in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. For the Ottoman Empire, the conquest of Constantinople and the establishment of Islam as the dominant religion marked a shift in religious dynamics. The city became a major center of Islamic culture and religion. The Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, and Constantinople became the capital of the Ottoman Caliphate. Over time, the Ottomans would use their control over the city to solidify their position as a major power in the Muslim world. The fall of Constantinople therefore signaled not only the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, but also the shift from Christian dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean to the rise of the Ottoman Empire as the preeminent power in the region. The religious implications of this change would be felt for centuries, as the Ottoman Empire continued to expand into Europe and the Middle East, shaping the religious landscape of the region. The geopolitical shift. The rise of the Ottoman Empire. With the fall of Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire solidified its dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean. The capture of the city gave the Ottomans control over critical trade routes between Europe and Asia, and they soon expanded their influence across the Balkans, Anatolia, and parts of North Africa. The Ottomans established a centralized imperial system that incorporated diverse cultures, languages, and religions, yet maintained strong Muslim governance. The Ottoman Empire's rise as the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean was a direct result of the fall of Constantinople. The Ottomans' control over Constantinople allowed them to consolidate power and expand their empire into Europe. They would go on to conquer much of southeastern Europe, including Greece, the Balkans, and Hungary, and they remained a major force in European and Middle Eastern politics for centuries. For the Christian world, the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople was a wake-up call. The Ottomans were now poised to expand further into Europe, and the fall of Constantinople marked the beginning of centuries of Ottoman expansion. The fear of Ottoman encroachment led to the formation of alliances between European states, and the eventual rise of powerful military coalitions, including the Holy League, aimed at containing Ottoman influence. The legacy of the fall, a city reborn as Istanbul. Despite the devastation of the fall, the legacy of Constantinople as a cultural and religious center never fully disappeared. Under Ottoman rule, the city was transformed, but its strategic location and historical significance ensured that it would continue to be a vital center of commerce, culture, and religion. The Ottomans rebuilt much of the city, adding magnificent mosques, palaces, and markets, and it soon became one of the world's most important cities. Constantinople was renamed Istanbul, and the city flourished as the capital of the Ottoman Empire, continuing to serve as a bridge between East and West for centuries to come. Today, Istanbul remains a city where the echoes of its Byzantine and Ottoman past resonate. The Hagia Sophia, once the great cathedral of the Eastern Orthodox Church, now stands as a symbol of the city's layered history, having served as both a mosque and a museum. The city's architecture, culture, and heritage reflect the complex history of Constantinople, a city that survived centuries of change, conquest, and cultural fusion. As we reflect on the fall of Constantinople, we are left with a profound question: how did the fall of this great city shape the future of empires, religions, and cultures? And what does it teach us about the fragility of civilizations in the face of external and internal pressure? The global repercussions and lasting impact of the fall of Constantinople. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 did not just mark the end of the Byzantine Empire, it signified the beginning of a new geopolitical reality that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. For the Christian world, it was a loss of an ancient and sacred center of faith. For the Ottomans, it was a pivotal victory that would help solidify their empire's dominance for centuries. But the consequences of the fall reached beyond the immediate political changes. It sent ripples through global trade, religious relations, and cultural development that would affect Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. The rise of the Ottoman Empire, a new power in the East. The conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans under Sultan Mehmed II, later known as Mehmed the Conqueror, secured the Ottoman Empire as the preeminent power in the eastern Mediterranean. The capture of Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, provided the Ottomans with a wealth of resources, both symbolic and material. Istanbul's strategic location between Europe and Asia allowed the Ottomans to control crucial trade routes, enabling them to dominate the region's commerce and military activity for centuries. Mediterranean. The capture of Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, provided the Ottomans with a wealth of resources, both symbolic and material. Istanbul's strategic location between Europe and Asia allowed the Ottomans to control crucial trade routes, enabling them to dominate the region's commerce and military activity for centuries. With Constantinople now firmly under Ottoman control, the city became the new capital of the empire, and Mehmed II set about rebuilding and revitalizing the once great metropolis. The city was transformed into a center of Islamic culture, architecture, and religion. The Hagia Sophia, a once Christian cathedral and symbol of the Byzantine Empire, was converted into a mosque, and it stands today as one of the most iconic landmarks of Istanbul. Under the Ottomans, the city's population swelled, and the Ottomans established a centralized administrative system that unified much of the Balkans, Anatolia, and parts of North Africa under their rule. The capture of Constantinople marked the beginning of a period of rapid Ottoman expansion. From 1453 onward, the Ottomans began to push deeper into Eastern Europe, conquering lands such as Greece, the Balkans, and parts of Hungary. This expansion was not only military but cultural, as the Ottomans sought to bring the regions they conquered under the influence of Islam and Ottoman governance. Over the next centuries, the Ottoman Empire would grow to become one of the largest and most powerful empires in the world. For the Christian world, the rise of the Ottoman Empire was a profound threat. As the Ottomans expanded into Europe, the Christian powers of the West, particularly the Holy Roman Empire, Spain and later Russia, began to take notice. This led to the creation of coalitions designed to push back Ottoman expansion, such as the Holy League, formed in the late 16th century. The Ottomans' military prowess and their control over strategic regions made them a persistent and formidable adversary for European power. The impact on global trade and exploration. One of the most immediate consequences of the fall of Constantinople was its disruption of the long-standing trade routes between Europe and Asia. The city had been a vital commercial hub, connecting Europe to the wealth of the East. After the Ottomans took control of Constantinople, they gained access to these critical trade routes, which had previously been controlled by the Byzantines and other Christian powers. The Ottoman monopoly on trade in the Eastern Mediterranean meant that European nations had to find alternative ways to access goods from Asia. This shift in trade routes spurred European powers to look beyond the traditional land routes to Asia. The search for new paths to the east became one of the driving forces behind the Age of Exploration. Portuguese explorers seeking a route to India around Africa, and Spanish navigators looking for a westward passage set sail during the late 15th and early 16th. Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492, although initially seeking a route to Asia, led to the accidental discovery of the Americas. Similarly, Vasco da Gama's successful voyage to India in 1498 established Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean. The fall of Constantinople, in essence, catalyzed the exploration of the New World and the establishment of maritime empires. The Ottomans' control of traditional trade routes drove Europe's need to explore alternative paths to Asia, which resulted in the opening up of new territories, new trading opportunities, and the eventual establishment of European colonial empires. This transformation in global trade marked a significant shift in world history, laying the groundwork for the economic systems and global exchanges that would characterize the modern era. Religious consequences. The deepening divide between Christianity and Islam. The fall of Constantinople also had profound religious consequences. The conquest of the city by the Ottomans marked the definitive spread of Islam in the Eastern Mediterranean, and it served as a powerful symbol of the Ottoman Empire's rise as a global Islamic superpower. For the Christian world, the loss of Constantinople was seen as a direct blow to the Christian faith. The city had been a center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity for over 1,000 years, and its fall symbolized the triumph of Islam over Christianity. In the years following the conquest, the Ottomans solidified their control over the religious landscape of the region. While the Ottomans allowed religious diversity within their empire, with Christian and Jewish communities allowed to practice their faiths, the political and religious dominance of Islam was clear. The Ottomans' treatment of the Christian population was relatively tolerant compared to other conquerors, but Christians in the empire were still subject to certain restrictions, including higher taxes, the jizya tax for non-Muslims, and limitations on religious and political power. The fall of Constantinople also deepened the divide between Catholic and Orthodox Christianity. The Byzantine Empire had long been the center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and its fall marked the end of the Orthodox Church's dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean. While the Orthodox Church continued to have a presence in the Ottoman Empire, it was increasingly marginalized by the rise of Islam. In the West, the Catholic Church became the dominant Christian force, and the split between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, which had existed since the Great Schism of 1024, became even more pronounced. The religious ramifications of the fall were not confined to Europe and the Middle East. The event also influenced the relationships between Islam and Christianity in the centuries that followed. The ongoing Ottoman expansion into Europe, particularly through their efforts to conquer Hungary and their siege of Vienna in the late 16th century, created an enduring religious rivalry between the Catholic Christian powers of Europe and the Muslim Ottoman. The Ottoman Empire's expansion into Europe became a defining feature of the early modern period, with religious tensions fueling military and cultural clashes for centuries. The legacy of Constantinople, a bridge between East and West, Despite the Ottoman conquest and the eventual transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul, the city's legacy as a cultural and intellectual crossroads between East and West remained. The blending of Byzantine, Roman and Islamic influences created a unique cultural tapestry in Istanbul. The city became a center for art, architecture and learning, continuing to attract scholars, artists and merchants from across the world. The legacy of the Byzantine Empire, which had long preserved the knowledge of the ancient world, was passed on through the Ottomans, albeit in a new context. The Ottoman Empire maintained and developed much of the infrastructure left behind by the Byzantines, including the city's architectural wonders and scholarly tradition. Istanbul remained an important cultural and intellectual center, bridging the gap between Europe and Asia, and serving as a symbol of the continuity and change that had taken place since the Roman Empire's fall. The fall of Constantinople was also a pivotal moment in the history of world civilizations. It marked the end of an era for one of the longest-lasting empires in history, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in global history. The Ottoman Empire, with its conquests and cultural achievements, would continue to shape the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe for centuries. As we reflect on the fall of Constantinople, we are left with the thought-provoking question: how did this moment, when one empire fell and another rose, shape the course of history? And how do the complex legacies of both the Byzantine and Ottoman empires continue to influence the world? The sinking of the Titanic, the tragedy that shook the world, the dream and the reality. The building of the Titanic. In the early 20th century, the world was mesmerized by the rapid advancements in technology, transportation, and engineering. The desire to push the boundaries of human achievement seemed endless, and nothing symbolized this spirit more than the creation of the RMS Titanic, an ocean liner that was touted as the largest, most luxurious and safest ship ever built. The Titanic was the brainchild of the White Star Line, a British shipping company that sought to create a vessel that would not only dominate the seas, but also define the future of luxury travel. The Titanic was designed by Bruce Ismay, the managing director of White Star Line, and constructed at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland. The ship was to be the epitome of opulence, designed to cater to the wealthiest passengers, while also offering relatively affordable travel for those in steerage, the lowest class of passengers. The ship's sheer size was unprecedented, measuring 82 feet in length and weighing approximately 46,000 tons. The Titanic was equipped with state-of-the-art amenities, including a swimming pool, gymnasium, Turkish baths, and lavish dining rooms, all intended to cater to the high society passengers who could afford the finest comforts. It was, by all accounts, a floating palace. The Titanic was designed to carry over 2,200 passengers and crew. It had a remarkable number of lifeboats, and its hull was constructed with a double-bottomed design that was believed to make the ship unsinkable. The ship's builders and its owners, confident in the ship's advanced technology and safety measures, felt secure in the belief that the Titanic was impervious to disaster. Even the press coverage leading up to its maiden voyage was filled with superlatives, often describing the ship as unsinkable and the ship of dreams. The ship's maiden voyage was set for April 10, 1912, from Southampton, England, bound for New York City. The Titanic was to make stops in France and Ireland before heading across the Atlantic. On board were some of the wealthiest and most prominent individuals of the time, including industrial magnates, aristocrats and celebrities. The excitement surrounding the Titanic's launch was palpable, and the world eagerly awaited the crossing that would mark the beginning of a new era in ocean travel. But behind the grandeur and excitement, a dark reality was beginning to take shape. Despite the ship's design being hailed as nearly perfect, there were issues with the number of lifeboats on board. The Titanic was carrying only enough lifeboats for about half of the passengers. The lifeboats, though plentiful in comparison to other ships of the time, were insufficient to carry all those aboard in the event of an emergency. While the designers and owners of the ship had justified this by pointing to the ship's unsinkable qualities, the tragic events that would unfold would prove that this was a dangerous oversight. The Titanic was more than just a marvel of technology. It represented a certain view of human hubris, where confidence in modern engineering and progress overshadowed the potential for failure. The idea that such a grand ship could ever be in danger seemed almost inconceivable. This very sense of invincibility would come crashing down with the ship's tragic end. The voyage begins, a journey across the Atlantic. On April 10, 1912, The Titanic set sail from Southampton, embarking on what was supposed to be a routine journey across the Atlantic. The atmosphere aboard the ship was one of luxury and celebration. First-class passengers were treated to extravagant meals and entertainment, while the second and third-class passengers also enjoyed unprecedented comfort for their respective fares. Despite some minor delays, the ship departed on schedule, and the Titanic's first few days at sea were smooth and uneventful. The weather was clear, and the ocean was calm, which only added to the sense of grandeur and safety that surrounded the ship. On board, passengers were awed by the ship's amenities and its size. Many marveled at the luxurious dining rooms, the grand staircase, and the sophisticated services offered by the crew. There was a sense of awe, as well as an undercurrent of pride, as passengers and crew alike realized that they were part of something historic, the first voyage of what was considered the greatest ship ever built. Despite the luxurious setting, however, there were concerns from some quarters. Captain Edward J. Smith, an experienced and respected figure in the British maritime world, was at the helm of the Titanic. Yet, Smith's confidence in the ship's ability to withstand anything the sea might throw at it may have led to complacency. The ship was sailing at near maximum speed through icy waters, a decision that would prove disastrous in the days to come. Even as passengers enjoyed the comforts of the ship, tensions began to emerge among the crew and passengers, though these were relatively minor and often related to the inconvenience of certain shipboard conditions. The Titanic was a massive vessel, and on such a large scale, even the smallest imperfections in the service or onboard experience could spark conversation. But for the most part, these early days of the voyage passed without incident, and the ship's reputation as a marvel of modern engineering seemed secure. The iceberg, the catalyst for disaster. On the evening of April 14, 1912, 4 days into the Titanic's maiden voyage, disaster struck. The ship was sailing through waters known to be filled with icebergs, but Captain Smith, confident in the ship's design and speed, had not taken any special precautions to navigate more slowly or carefully. At approximately 11:40 p.m., a lookout in the crow's nest spotted an iceberg directly in the ship's path. Despite the efforts to avoid the iceberg, it was too late. The Titanic collided with the massive block of ice along its starboard, right side, causing a series of punctures in the ship's hull. The ship's watertight compartments, designed to keep the ship afloat in the event of a breach, were compromised. The collision caused the first 5 of these compartments to flood, and it was clear that the ship would not remain afloat for long. The damage to the ship was catastrophic. The Titanic, as it had been touted, was a marvel of engineering, unsinkable, or so it was believed. The reality was far more tragic. The ship's design, though innovative, was not invulnerable. The reach in the hull, combined with the inadequate number of lifeboats, meant that the ship's fate was sealed the moment it struck the iceberg. Panic spread as the ship began to list and sink. The crew worked frantically to launch lifeboats, but chaos soon overtook the ship. Many lifeboats were launched half full, as passengers were reluctant to leave the ship, believing that the situation could still be controlled. The Titanic's officers and crew tried their best to maintain order, but the ship's sheer size and the overwhelming sense of impending doom made it difficult to prevent panic from spreading. The Titanic, once seen as an invincible symbol of progress, was sinking, and in the icy waters of the North Atlantic, the tragedy of the Titanic began to unfold in ways that no one could have anticipated. The chaos and courage of the Titanic's final hours. As the Titanic began its fateful descent into the icy waters of the Atlantic Ocean, the atmosphere aboard the ship shifted from disbelief to desperation. What had initially seemed like an inconvenience, an unusual incident, quickly became a horrifying reality. The passengers and crew, who had for so long trusted in the invincibility of the great ship, now faced the terrifying prospect that the Titanic would not be the unsinkable vessel it was promised to be. The first signs of disaster, the ship's last moments afloat. When the Titanic struck the iceberg at around 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, it caused a tear along the starboard side of the ship. The force of the impact was severe enough to flood several of the Titanic's watertight compartments. The damage was more than just cosmetic. These compartments, designed to hold back water in the event of a hull breach, were compromised. The ship's fate had been sealed. Initially, many aboard the Titanic did not grasp the gravity of the situation. It was not uncommon for large ships to experience accidents or damage, but the Titanic had been built to withstand just about any disaster, or so its designers believed. Captain Edward J. Smith, though concerned, initially downplayed the severity of the damage, telling the passengers that there was no need for panic. As a result, many passengers stayed in their cabins or continued to enjoy the comfort and luxury the ship provided, unaware that the situation was becoming increasingly dire. The reality of the ship's damage became evident only as the cold, salty water began to rise within the Titanic's lower levels. As the watertight compartments filled, the immense weight began to pull the ship's bow lower into the water. By 12:05 a.m., the first lifeboat was lowered into the sea. It carried just a handful of people, mostly women and children, as the initial response was disorganized and chaotic. Many passengers hesitated to board, unwilling to leave the ship or unsure of the true danger they were in. Some believed the Titanic would stay afloat long enough for help to arrive, while others were unsure how to navigate the confusing and often contradictory orders from the crew. In the early stages of the disaster, there was a notable disconnect between the calm and composed demeanor of some officers and the rising panic among passengers. As the ship's bow dipped further into the ocean, it was clear that time was running out. By now, the Titanic had taken on a distinct list, with its stern rising high out of the water. As the ship began its final plunge into the depths of the Atlantic, the lifeboats, a harrowing shortage of safety. One of the most tragic aspects of the Titanic disaster was the lifeboat shortage. While the Titanic had lifeboats for roughly half of the passengers aboard, many of these lifeboats were not filled to capacity. There were several factors contributing to this. Many passengers hesitated to board the lifeboat, thinking that they would be safer on the ship or that the situation was not as serious as it seemed. The crew, inexperienced in managing such an unprecedented disaster, struggled to maintain order in the chaos, and many of the lifeboats that were launched were not fully occupied, leaving hundreds of people stranded on the sinking ship. In some instances, lifeboats were lowered with only a few passengers aboard. The first-class passengers, often the wealthiest aboard the ship, were generally the first to be evacuated, and many of them were allowed to board the lifeboats while those in second and third class were left behind. The class divisions became painfully evident as the disaster unfolded, with the rich being given priority over the poor in terms of lifeboat access. Many third-class passengers confined to the lower decks were unable to reach the lifeboats in time due to the confusion and the lack of adequate crew to guide them. While some of the lifeboats were launched in an orderly fashion, others were lowered hastily with only a fraction of the seats filled. For example, lifeboat number 1, the first to be lowered, contained only 12 passengers despite its capacity for some passengers, believing the ship was not in immediate danger, either refused to board or hesitated to get into the lifeboats until it was too late. In these early hours, the officers of the Titanic, many of whom had served on the ship since its construction, remained calm, directing passengers to the lifeboats and attempting to keep order. However, their efforts were undermined by the enormity of the situation, and as the hours passed, panic began to set in. The crew struggled to manage the panic that spread across the ship as passengers scrambled for lifeboats, and many who had boarded the boats were helpless to assist those left behind. The final moments. The ship sinks. By around 2:00 a.m. on April 15, the Titanic's fate had been sealed. The ship's stern had risen so high that the angle was nearly vertical. The last remaining lifeboats were now being lowered into the cold, dark waters, and the crew's efforts to maintain order were largely futile. As the ship's massive bulk groaned under the strain of its sinking, the Titanic's electric lights flickered out, plunging the ship into darkness for those still aboard. At around 2:20 a.m., the Titanic's aft section was fully raised above the water, and the immense pressure on the ship's hull caused it to break apart. The once grand vessel, designed to be unsinkable, split into two pieces. The bow, now completely submerged, sank into the depths, and the stern followed shortly after. As the Titanic disappeared beneath the waves, the sounds of desperation filled the night. Some passengers who had been unable to board lifeboats clung to debris, while others fought for their lives in the freezing waters. In the chaos, many were pulled under by the immense weight of the ship as it sank, while others perished from hypothermia due to the frigid temperature of the Atlantic Ocean. The survivors, many of whom had been picked up by lifeboats, were left to drift in the icy waters for hours. The first of the rescue ships, the RMS Carpathia, arrived at around 4:00 a.m., some 2 hours after the Titanic sank. The Carpathia rescued the survivors from the lifeboats, but for many, The trauma of the night would never fade. Over 1,500 lives were lost in the disaster, a tragedy that would forever change the way the world viewed ocean travel. Aftermath. The shock heard around the world. The sinking of the Titanic was one of the most shocking disasters of the 20th century. When the news reached Europe and the United States, it sent shockwaves through society. The Titanic, as the world's largest and most luxurious ship, had been the symbol of technological progress and human achievement. The idea that such a grand vessel could sink was almost unfathomable. For the surviving passengers, the trauma of the event was compounded by the shocking loss of life. In the wake of the disaster, investigations were launched in both Britain and the United States. The inquiries revealed significant flaws in the Titanic's design, management, and response to the disaster. The shortage of lifeboats, the inadequate training of the crew, and the failure to heed warnings of icebergs in the ship's path all played roles in the catastrophe. These findings prompted changes in maritime safety regulations, including new rules requiring ships to have enough lifeboats for all passengers and to maintain better communication between ships about potential hazards at sea. In the years that followed, the Titanic's story became the subject of books, films, and documentaries. The tragedy captured the world's imagination, and the ship's final moments were immortalized in popular culture. The story of the Titanic has come to symbolize the dangers of hubris and the fragility of human endeavors, reminding us that even the most advanced technologies and the most confident assurances can be undone in an instant. As we reflect on the events of that fateful night, we are left with a profound question: how did the Titanic's tragedy, an event shaped by human ambition, technological advancement, and social divisions, foretell the vulnerabilities of the modern world, and what can we learn from it in the face of today's global challenges? The legacy of the Titanic and the lessons learned. The sinking of the Titanic was a profound event that left an indelible mark on history, shaping the way the world viewed safety, technology, and human ambition. The tragedy not only exposed the limitations of human engineering and foresight, but also ignited significant changes in maritime laws and safety protocols that are still relevant today. Over the years, the story of the Titanic has become more than just a disaster. It has become a symbol of the consequences of unchecked confidence in progress and a stark reminder of the fragility of human life. The immediate aftermath. A world in shock. When news of the Titanic's sinking reached the world, it sparked an outpouring of grief and disbelief. The Titanic had been the epitome of modernity and luxury, a ship that embodied the technological advancements and optimism of the early 20th century. Its loss seemed incomprehensible. The fact that the unsinkable ship had sunk, taking over 1,500 lives with it, was a sobering reminder of the limits of human control over nature. For many, the sinking of the Titanic shattered the illusion that human ingenuity could overcome any obstacle. The shock was not only felt by the families of the victims, but also by the general public. The Titanic had become a global symbol, and its sudden loss left a void in the collective consciousness. The news reports, which followed the rescue of the few surviving passengers, painted a harrowing picture of the final hours aboard the ship. Eyewitness accounts from survivors, many of whom had barely escaped with their lives, told of the chaos, confusion, and terror that filled the night. The stories of the last moments of the Titanic were seared into the public's memory. The tragedy also brought to light the social divisions that existed aboard the ship. First-class passengers were given priority in the lifeboats, while many of the poorer passengers, especially those in third class, were left to fend for themselves. The disaster exposed the inequalities that existed in society, even in life-or-death situations. This stark contrast between the treatment of the wealthy and the working class sparked public outrage and increased the sense of injustice surrounding the event. The inquiries and the immediate changes in maritime safety in the wake of the disaster. Formal inquiries were launched in both Britain and the United States to investigate the causes of the sinking and the failures in response. The inquiries were wide-ranging, examining the ship's design, the crew's actions, the lack of sufficient lifeboats, and the failure to heed warnings about icebergs. The findings were damning. One of the most significant revelations from the inquiries was the Titanic's lack of enough lifeboats for all passengers. While the ship carried 20 lifeboats, enough for only about half of the people on board, it was believed that the ship's size and safety features made additional lifeboats unnecessary. The regulations of the time only required lifeboats for a fraction of the ship's capacity, as they were thought to be sufficient in the event of an emergency. This failure to provide enough lifeboats led to widespread calls for changes in maritime law. The inquiry also revealed that the crew was ill-prepared to respond to a disaster of this magnitude. Despite drills and procedures, the crew's training was insufficient to handle the emergency. The lifeboats were launched haphazardly, and many were not filled to capacity due to confusion and panic. The captain and crew's failure to slow the ship in response to iceberg warnings was another point of contention. In the aftermath of the Titanic disaster, governments around the world took action. In Britain, the British Board of Trade introduced new regulations that required ships to carry enough lifeboats for every passenger, regardless of class. The regulations also mandated that lifeboat drills be conducted regularly and that officers be trained in emergency procedures. These changes marked the beginning of a new era in maritime safety, with ships becoming more prepared for emergencies and better equipped to respond to disasters. The global impact. The end of the Age of Innocence. The sinking of the Titanic had far-reaching effects on the way society viewed both technology and progress. The disaster marked the end of an era, the Age of Innocence, during which the belief in the boundless potential of human ingenuity and modernity seemed unshakable. The Titanic had been the epitome of this belief. It was not just a ship, it was a symbol of human achievement, of the promise that technology could conquer nature, and yet, in one tragic night, that promise was shattered. The Titanic disaster also shifted the way people thought about the role of governments and industries in regulating safety. It raised questions about corporate responsibility, as the White Star Line had downplayed safety concerns and the true risks of traveling on such a massive ship. The disaster prompted a re-evaluation of corporate accountability, particularly in industries where the safety of human life is at stake. The world began to demand more rigorous safety standards and greater transparency from corporations, especially in sectors that dealt with public transportation. Additionally, the Titanic story became a defining cultural touchstone for the 20th century. It was more than just a disaster. It was a tragedy that encapsulated the human cost of overconfidence, social inequality, and the failure to acknowledge the limits of progress. The Titanic became a symbol of hubris, and its story would be retold for generations, in books, films, documentaries, and more. The Titanic's legacy was one of cautionary lessons, not only about maritime safety but also about the importance of humility in the face of nature's power. The resurrection of the Titanic, cultural and emotional resonance. For decades after the Titanic disaster, the memory of the ship remained alive in the public imagination. Its story became part of the cultural fabric of the 20th century, symbolizing not only the tragedy of that night, but also the hope, the dreams, and the ambitions of the people who had boarded it. The legacy of the Titanic was passed down through generations, inspiring books, films, and exhibitions, all of which sought to capture the grandeur, the tragedy, and the lessons of the disaster. In the late 20th century, the discovery of the Titanic wreckage on the ocean floor brought a renewed wave of interest in the ship. In 1985, the wreck was located about 12,500 feet beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, and the discovery captivated the world. The images of the wreck, frozen in time, spurred a new era of Titanic fascination, with countless expeditions, documentaries, and artifacts exhibitions, shedding light on the lost ship's final resting place. The Titanic also found a new cultural life in the 1997 blockbuster film Titanic, directed by James Cameron. The film captured the tragedy and heroism of the sinking, bringing the story to a new generation of viewers and reigniting worldwide interest in the disaster. The film was a cultural phenomenon, and it won 11 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. The movie's portrayal of the Titanic's doomed voyage added a new layer of emotional resonance to the story, solidifying the Titanic's place as one of the most iconic and enduring stories of the modern era. Reflection: the Titanic's enduring legacy. As we look back on the sinking of the Titanic, we are faced with a complex and poignant reflection. The tragedy not only exposed the frailty of human progress, but also revealed the deep-seated social inequalities of the time. The ship's design, its confidence in being unsinkable, and its tragic end serve as reminders of the unpredictable forces of nature and the human limitations in controlling them. The Titanic's story is not just one of a ship and its passengers, it is the story of ambition, failure, and resilience in the face of adversity. The legacy of the Titanic lives on, not only in the world of maritime safety but in the collective memory of humanity. It stands as a testament to the fragility of life and the complexities of human achievement. The story of the Titanic reminds us of the lessons we must learn from our past. The importance of preparation, humility, and the need for vigilance in the face of uncertainty. The ship may have sunk, but the lessons it taught continue to resonate. As we reflect on the Titanic's legacy, we ask, what can we learn from the failure of human pride and the vulnerability of progress? How can the story of the Titanic, as a symbol of human ambition, inform the challenges and technologies of today, where overconfidence in modern systems can still lead to disaster? The Dust Bowl, America's epic environmental disaster starter, the land of promise and the seeds of crisis. The early 20th century in America was a time of optimism and expansion. The nation was in the midst of rapid industrialization, with modern technology reshaping daily life. The vast plains of the American Midwest were seen as the epitome of opportunity. For many, these fertile lands offered the promise of prosperity. Farmers flocked to the Great Plains, eager to stake their claim in what was thought to be an agricultural paradise. The land stretched out in vast golden fields, and with the Homestead Act of 1862, the government encouraged settlers to populate the plains. It seemed as though the promise of riches was just within reach for those who worked the soil. Farmers in the Midwest planted wheat and other crops that grew well in the rich soil of the plains. This land was once part of a massive inland sea, and as a result, its soil was incredibly fertile. Early settlers, including farmers from other parts of the US and Europe, saw the land as a place to build a future. With new technology and mechanized tools, farming in the Great Plains became more efficient. But this newfound success came with its own set of risks. Throughout the 1910s and early 1920s, farmers grew crops in vast monocultures, largely focused on wheat. As demand for grain rose, especially during World War I, the rush to plant and harvest crops intensified. The plains, with their rich, dark soil, were turned over at a rapid pace, but the delicate balance of the land began to shift. The soil was left bare, unprotected by natural grasses that had once held it together. The farming practices began to deplete the land's nutrients, and the erosion of the soil began slowly to take hold. For a while, the land appeared to be thriving. The rising global wheat prices during the war made many farmers wealthy, and the Midwest was often seen as a land of endless potential. However, the seeds of disaster were being planted in the fertile fields, though no one realized it at the time. The neglect of crop rotation, overuse of the soil, and a lack of awareness about the delicate ecological balance left the land vulnerable. The very crops that made farmers successful in the short term would ultimately lead to catastrophe. The most striking aspect of the farming boom in the plains was the rise of large-scale mechanized farming. Tractors replaced oxen, and enormous machines plowed the land more quickly than ever before. The sheer scale of agricultural production meant that vast expanses of land were cleared, but the natural grasses that had once held the soil in place were removed, leaving the earth exposed. This was the beginning of a slow-moving disaster that would eventually be felt across the entire region, leading to what we now know as the Dust Bowl, the winds of change, a slow and steady disaster. By the late 1920s, cracks were beginning to appear in the agricultural paradise that had once been promised. The weather, which had been relatively mild in the early decades of settlement, began to change. The plains, which had been known for their summer thunderstorms and plentiful rainfall, began to experience prolonged droughts. In 1930, the first signs of a larger ecological disaster began to show. Crops began to wither, and the soil became increasingly dry. In the absence of protective grasses, the soil was more vulnerable to the wind. Once the rains stopped coming, the topsoil dried up and turned to dust. The winds that frequently swept across the plains now had nothing to hold them back, and they began to pick up the loose earth. The once pristine soil that had been the foundation of the region's agricultural boom became a dangerous force. It blew across fields, burying crops, and creating vast dust clouds that blocked out the sun. By 1931, conditions had worsened dramatically. With each passing year, the drought continued, and the winds began to tear through the fields, eroding the land. The agricultural yield collapsed, and farmers who had relied on the plains to support their livelihoods saw their crops fail year after year. The soil, once rich and teeming with nutrients, was now barren and dry, unable to support the crops that had once thrived. The Dust Bowl had begun. The dust storms were not just a nuisance, they were a terrifying force. These black blizzards, as they were called, would roll across the plains, sometimes lasting for days. The storms would carry dust hundreds of miles, blanketing everything in their path. The dust could be so thick that it would suffocate animals, bury homes, and leave entire towns in darkness. It was not uncommon for people to wake up in the morning to find that their homes, barns, and fields were covered in layers of dust, and the air itself seemed thick and oppressive. For farmers and their families, the situation became dire. Without crops to sell, many farmers lost their livelihoods. The constant dust storms made it difficult to breathe, let alone work the fields. Livestock too suffered from the lack of food and water, and many died from the harsh conditions. In response to the worsening situation, farmers began to leave their homes and farms, hoping to find better prospects elsewhere. Many migrated westward to California, driven by the hopes of a better life, but they found little relief from the economic and environmental hardships they had faced in the Midwest. The human cost, migration and displacement. The Dust Bowl did not just destroy crops, it destroyed lives. Whole communities were uprooted by the environmental disaster. The Great Plains, once home to thriving towns and farms, became desolate. By the mid-1930s, around 2.5 million people had been displaced from the region, many of them heading west toward California in search of work and better living conditions. The story of these displaced people, the Okies, named after the state of Oklahoma, though they came from many different states, became an iconic symbol of the American migrant experience during the Great Depression. These migrants faced harsh conditions as they traveled, and many were forced to live in makeshift camps along the way. The journey westward was grueling, and even when they reached California, the promises of jobs and a better life were often unmet. Instead, they found themselves competing for low-paying agricultural work in the fields of California's Central Valley, where they were often met with hostility and discrimination. Their plight, however, became a central part of the American narrative, especially after John Steinbeck's famous novel The Grapes of Wrath, which chronicled the struggles of a migrant family fleeing the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl's human cost extended beyond displacement. Families were torn apart by the heating strain, and mental health issues including depression and anxiety were rampant. Communities that had once been close-knit now found themselves fractured, with families forced to leave their homes and livelihoods behind. The emotional toll was profound, as many felt that they had lost their connection to the land and their sense of identity. The government's response, the New Deal and environmental recovery. As the devastation of the Dust Bowl became more apparent, the federal government, led by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, stepped in to provide aid to the affected regions. The New Deal, a series of programs and policies designed to combat the economic effects of the Great Depression, included several initiatives aimed at addressing the environmental crisis. One of the key programs was the Soil Conservation Service, SCS, created in 1935 to help farmers prevent further soil erosion and rehabilitate the land. The SCS promoted techniques such as crop rotation, contour plowing, and planting grasses to help stabilize the soil. Farmers were encouraged to plant trees and use windbreaks to reduce the impact of the strong winds. These efforts helped slow the erosion and began the long process of restoring the land. In addition to the Soil Conservation Service, the New Deal also provided financial assistance to displaced farmers through programs like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, GPA, which aimed to raise crop prices by reducing the supply of certain crops. These measures, while controversial, helped stabilize the agricultural sector and provided relief to struggling farmers. The government's intervention also led to the establishment of rural electrification programs, which brought electricity to isolated areas of the Midwest. This helped improve living conditions and allowed farmers to modernize their operations, further boosting recovery efforts. The long-term lessons of the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl was a wake-up call for the United States, exposing the dangers of overexploitation of the land and the consequences of not understanding the delicate relationship between human activity and the environment. It highlighted the need for sustainable farming practices and the importance of environmental stewardship. In the years that followed, the country took steps to ensure that such a catastrophe would never happen again. The lessons of the Dust Bowl were not lost on future generations. Soil conservation efforts became a central part of agricultural policy, and awareness of environmental issues grew. The Dust Bowl also served as a reminder that human ambition, when unchecked, can lead to disastrous consequences for both people and the land. Today, the environmental legacy of the Dust Bowl lives on in modern farming practices and policies aimed at protecting the land for future generations. As we reflect on this environmental catastrophe, we are reminded that the balance between human progress and nature is fragile. The story of the Dust Bowl is one of both human suffering and resilience, and it asks a question that remains relevant today. How do we ensure that the pursuit of progress does not come at the expense of the land and resources that sustain us? The human cost of the Dust Bowl and the struggle for survival. The Dust Bowl's impact wasn't only felt in the soil, it seeped into the very lives of those who had once called the Great Plains their home. For the farmers and their families, the disaster was a slow, painful unraveling of everything they had worked for. The land that had once provided abundance was now barren, and with each passing day, their hopes of recovery grew dimmer. While the government and conservation efforts provided some relief, the human cost of the Dust Bowl was immeasurable, with many families forced into a desperate search for survival. The migrant experience, a desperate search for work, the exodus from the Great Plains was one of the defining features of the Dust Bowl. By the mid-1930s, as the dust storms grew fiercer and crops continued to fail, the number of displaced families surged. These families, often referred to as Okies, a term that originated in California but applied to migrants from many different states, traveled west in search of work, food and a better life. The journey was long and grueling, and many found themselves in squalid camps along the way, where resources were scarce and conditions were harsh. Upon reaching California, where they had hoped to find new opportunities in the fertile agricultural regions of the Central Valley, they were often met with disappointment. While the state's agricultural industry was booming, competition for jobs was fierce, and the migrants were treated as a cheap and expendable workforce. Many found themselves living in overcrowded, makeshift camps that lacked sanitation, clean water, and basic amenities. The migrants were often forced to work for low wages in grueling conditions. The jobs they were able to secure were largely seasonal and poorly paid, and many were subjected to discrimination. The wealthier landowners and agricultural companies, already established in the region, often viewed these new arrivals with disdain. They were seen as a burden, rather than a boon, and the migrants were sometimes relegated to working under the most inhumane conditions. The sense of disillusionment among the migrants was palpable. Many had come to California with the hope of starting fresh, but they soon realized that the promise of a better life was an illusion. The migration was not only a physical journey but an emotional one, as families had to come to terms with their lost homes, lost livelihoods, and lost dreams. For many, the journey was more than just a search for work. It was a search for dignity and hope in the face of a seemingly insurmountable disaster. The toll on health and mental well-being beyond the physical hardships of migration. The Dust Bowl had profound psychological effects on the families who lived through it. The constant barrage of dust storms, the failure of crops, the loss of homes, and the threat of starvation all took a toll on the mental health of the people who endured it. Many families found themselves in a constant state of fear and uncertainty, never knowing if the next storm would bury their homes or whether they would have enough food to survive the next winter. The dust storms themselves were not just a visual nuisance, they were a physical assault on the body. Dust could seep into everything: homes, clothes, food, and even into the lungs. The constant exposure to fine dust particles led to a condition known as dust pneumonia, which affected many people, particularly children and the elderly. Those who survived the harsh conditions often found themselves weakened and debilitated both physically and mentally. The emotional toll was also significant. As the dust continued to swirl and the crops failed year after year, many families felt as if they were trapped in an unending nightmare. The loss of identity, community, and stability was devastating. Men who had once seen themselves as the providers for their families found themselves unable to feed their children or keep their farms running. Women, often left to tend to their families in the face of growing hardships, experienced feelings of isolation and helpless. Children, too, were affected, not only by the lack of food and safety but by the disruption of their entire way of life. Many families experienced depression, anxiety, and a sense of shame as they saw their neighbors and friends suffer the same fate. The sense of community that had once existed among the rural families of the Great Plains was being eroded by the relentless environmental pressures they faced. The impact on family life and migration patterns. The upheaval of family life in the Dust Bowl was stark. Parents, often desperate to keep their families together, faced the difficult decision of whether to stay and fight for survival, or to leave their homes in search of work and security. For many, the decision to leave was not just about economics, it was about survival. The agricultural depression of the Great Plains meant that even if a family did manage to harvest crops, they would have little to sell or trade. The destruction of the soil meant that there was nothing left to cultivate, and the costs of farming continued to climb. For some, the Dust Bowl forced an involuntary migration westward, while others fled to cities in the east in search of work in factories or industrial jobs. The migration was not just an escape from the land, it was a painful reconfiguration of families. In many cases, children were sent to relatives or foster families while parents searched for work. The traditional family structure was upended, and many families never reunited. The migrant workers, often referred to as Okies, were treated with contempt by the populations of California and other western states. Many of these workers were viewed as a drain on resources, and the cultural divide between the established farming communities and the new arrivals was wide. The migrant workers were often seen as inferior, and racial prejudice against them was widespread. The treatment of the Okies in California and other parts of the West was a reflection of the broader social divisions in the US. And the hostility they encountered added a layer of suffering to an already difficult life. The government's response, relief efforts, and the New Deal. In response to the growing humanitarian crisis of the Dust Bowl, the US government began to implement relief programs through the New Deal, designed to alleviate the suffering of the displaced farmers and provide them with a way to rebuild their lives. While these programs did not immediately solve all the problems, they marked a significant shift in the government's approach to economic and environmental crises. The Soil Conservation Service, created in 1935 as part of the New Deal, began to promote better farming practices to prevent soil erosion and restore the land. The government encouraged farmers to rotate crops, plant cover crops, and adopt more sustainable agricultural practices. The idea was to prevent further erosion and to help restore the natural balance of the land, which had been disrupted by years of over-farming and poor land management. The New Deal also provided direct financial assistance to farmers through the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, which paid farmers to reduce crop production in an effort to raise prices. Though controversial, the AAA helped stabilize agricultural markets and gave farmers a small financial cushion during the worst years of the Dust Bowl. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration (FERA) provided funds to state and local governments to aid those most in need, including migrant workers. The Works Progress Administration (WPA) created jobs through public works projects, providing employment opportunities for displaced workers and helping to rebuild the economy. While these programs helped some families survive and offered relief to those in desperate need, they were often not enough to reverse the devastating effects of the Dust Bowl. The psychological toll of the disaster, combined with the loss of homes and land, left many families with lasting scars. The long-term impact, environmental awareness and recovery. In the years following the Dust Bowl, the United States began to adopt a more cautious approach to land management. The Dust Bowl led to a greater recognition of the fragility of the environment and the importance of sustainable farming practices. Over time, farmers learned to respect the land in new ways, embracing soil conservation methods that would help prevent such a catastrophe from occurring again. The New Deal programs helped initiate this recovery, but the lessons of the Dust Bowl remained ingrained in the national consciousness. The disaster brought environmental concerns to the forefront of political and social discourse, and marked the beginning of a national dialogue about conservation and the need for better land management policies. As the land began to recover and more effective farming techniques were adopted, the Great Plains slowly rebounded. However, the scars of the Dust Bowl remained, both on the land and in the memories of those who lived through it. The tragedy of the Dust Bowl served as a reminder of the delicate balance between nature and human activity, and the consequences that can arise when that balance is disrupted. Reflection. The Dust Bowl's lessons for the future. The Dust Bowl stands as a powerful reminder of the dangers of overexploitation and the need to protect the natural environment. It serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked human ambition and the importance of sustainable practices. As the world faces new environmental challenges today, such as climate change and deforestation, the lessons learned from the Dust Bowl remain as relevant as ever. As we reflect on the Dust Bowl, we are left with a central question: how can we learn from past environmental disasters to create a future that balances human progress with ecological stewardship? The resilience and recovery. From destruction to renewal, the aftermath of the Dust Bowl was marked by an overwhelming sense of loss, displacement, and devastation. The environmental and social damage caused by the prolonged drought, relentless dust storms, and unsustainable farming practices had left the Great Plains nearly barren. Yet, amid the widespread suffering, there was also an extraordinary resilience among the people who had endured. Over the years, the people of the plains, with the help of government intervention and a changing understanding of land management, would begin the long, arduous process of recovery. The resilience of the people, the spirit of survival. Despite the overwhelming challenges, the people who lived through the Dust Bowl displayed remarkable perseverance. For many families, the decision to stay and rebuild was rooted in a deep connection to the land. The farmers, some of whom had lost everything, homes, crops, and livestock, continued to search for ways to stay on their farms, even as their environment seemed to be fighting against them. Many families, like the Jodes and John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, became emblematic of the struggles faced by those displaced by the disaster. The Jodes, a fictional family, represent the countless real families who, after losing their farms, travelled west in search of work and a better life. The emotional toll of this forced migration was immense, but so too was the determination to rebuild and survive, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As the dust storms persisted, many farmers were forced to abandon their fields, yet some remained, holding on to the belief that the land could recover if they were patient enough. Over time, these farmers began to implement new agricultural practices, learning from the failures of the past. Though much of the region had been irreparably damaged, they believed that with time and careful attention, the land could be restored to its former productivity. This belief in recovery and the land's eventual renewal was essential to the survival of the Dust Bowl's survivors. Even as communities fractured and many families migrated away, there remained a strong sense of hope that things could improve, if not immediately, then in the future. Their resilience in the face of such hardship ultimately laid the foundation for recovery and renewal in the years to come. The role of the New Deal, government intervention and soil conservation. The federal government's response to the Dust Bowl was critical in the long-term recovery of the region. As part of President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, the government initiated a number of programs designed to assist both the people and the land affected by the disaster. These programs not only provided immediate relief to displaced families, but also sought to prevent future environmental disasters. One of the most significant actions taken was the establishment of the Soil Conservation Service, SCS, in 1935. This government agency was tasked with promoting agricultural practices that would prevent soil erosion and restore the health of the land. The SCS encouraged farmers to adopt new techniques, such as crop rotation, contour ploughing, and the planting of cover crops, to reduce the risk of erosion. These methods helped to restore the balance between farming and the environment, ensuring that the land would not be overworked or depleted again. Farmers were also encouraged to plant grasslands as a natural barrier to the winds, which had been a major factor in the dust storms. The planting of trees along the edges of fields, known as windbreaks, helped reduce the impact of the strong winds that had previously stripped the soil away. These efforts were crucial in stabilizing the soil and preventing further erosion. While the recovery of the land was slow, these efforts made a significant difference. Over time, the soil became less vulnerable to wind erosion, and farmers began to see the results of their hard work. While the Dust Bowl left a permanent scar on the Great Plains, these conservation practices helped prevent the worst from happening again. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, part of the New Deal, also played a role in restoring the agricultural economy. The AAA paid farmers to reduce the amount of land they planted on, which helped increase the prices of crops. While controversial at the time, the act provided much-needed relief to struggling farmers, helping to stabilize the agricultural sector in the wake of the Dust Bowl. The long-term environmental lessons. a shift towards sustainability. The recovery from the Dust Bowl marked a pivotal turning point in American agriculture and environmental policy. The crisis forced the country to confront the realities of industrial farming and the dangers of exploiting the land without regard for sustainability. The Dust Bowl's devastating effects sparked a widespread awareness of the need for better land stewardship and conservation effort. The environmental lessons learned from the Dust Bowl began to shape the way Americans viewed farming and the environment. While the immediate aftermath of the disaster focused on recovery, the long-term impact was a shift toward more sustainable agricultural practices. Over time, soil conservation became a central part of agricultural policy, and the federal government continued to invest in land management and conservation programs. The establishment of the Natural Resources Conservation Service (NRCS) in 1935, which succeeded the SCS, ensured that soil conservation remained a priority for the federal government. Today, the NRCS continues to work with farmers to implement sustainable practices that protect the land and ensure its productivity for future generations. The Dust Bowl also prompted a greater awareness of the interconnectedness between human activities and the natural environment. As the effects of climate change and environmental degradation continue to be felt across the world, the lessons of the Dust Bowl remain relevant. The disaster underscored the importance of understanding the limits of the land and the need to balance human development with environmental preservation. The Dust Bowl's cultural legacy, a national story of endurance. While the Dust Bowl was a disaster, it also became a story of endurance and survival. The farmers, migrants and families who lived through the Dust Bowl have become symbols of resilience. Their struggles were immortalized not only in literature, such as Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, but also in the oral histories and personal accounts of those who lived through the disaster. The stories as the Dust Bowl survivors became part of the broader American narrative, representing the struggles of ordinary people in the face of immense adversity. The images of the Dust Bowl, from the vast fields of dust to the weary faces of migrant workers, have become iconic symbols of the Great Depression and the resilience of the American spirit. These images, captured in photographs and stories, have helped to shape the American collective memory. The Dust Bowl survivors' stories are now woven into the fabric of American identity, symbolizing the hardships faced by a generation but also their courage and determination to rebuild. As the Great Plains slowly recovered, the region found a new sense of identity. The communities that had once been fractured by the environmental disaster began to rebuild, and a new generation grew up, knowing both the lessons and the strength that had been passed down from those who had survived the Dust Bowl. Reflection: the Dust Bowl's enduring relevance. The Dust Bowl stands as one of the most devastating environmental disasters in American history, but it is also a story of recovery, resilience, and lessons learned. The disaster revealed the consequences of overworking the land, ignoring the environmental limits of the Great Plains, and the perils of human overconfidence in agricultural technology. The response to the Dust Bowl, the government intervention, the shift towards sustainable farming practices, and the focus on soil conservation marked a new chapter in American environmental policy. Today, as the world faces new environmental challenges, from climate change to deforestation, the lessons learned from the Dust Bowl remain as pertinent as ever. The disaster demonstrated the importance of managing the environment responsibly and the need to adapt our practices to protect the land for future generations. The Dust Bowl, as a symbol of both tragedy and recovery, challenges us to reflect on our own relationship with the land. It asks us to consider how we can prevent such crises from happening again, and how we can ensure that future generations inherit a world that is both livable and sustainable. The Dust Bowl was not just a disaster for the Great Plains, it was a turning point for the entire country. It serves as a reminder that human ambition must be tempered with a respect for nature, and that in times of crisis, the strength of the human spirit is capable of overcoming even the harshest challenges.